Four brothers stood frozen in a Montana blizzard staring at the stagecoach that had just destroyed every plan they'd made. They had ordered three mail-order brides to save their dying ranch. Instead, four Chinese sisters stepped into the snow, proud, unafraid, and refusing to be separated. Behind them, a ruthless businessman had forged documents claiming ownership of their very lives. The sisters carried one demand: they stay together or they don't stay at all. In that moment, with the wind howling and the future hanging by a thread, the oldest brother faced an impossible choice. If you're ready for a story of courage, survival, and unexpected love on the American frontier, stay with me until the very end, and please like this video and comment what city you are watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. The wind came down from the Bitterroot Mountains like something with teeth, and Caleb Holt had been standing at the window of Coldwater Creek's stage station long enough to memorize every shadow it carved in the snow. He had watched the storm swallow the road mile by mile, the white erasure moving east, the way trouble always moves slowly at first, then all at once. Behind him, his three brothers occupied the small waiting room with the collective restlessness of men who had nowhere better to be and everywhere better to be at the same time. Fletcher paced the floorboards in a tight, repeating circuit, his boots leaving a worn path he seemed determined to deepen. Reed sat perfectly still in the corner chair, a coffee cup balanced on his knee, studying the steam as though it might spell out the future. Jesse, youngest at 23 and constitutionally incapable of holding, still had taken a piece of hickory from the kindling box and was reducing it to splinters with a pocket knife he'd sharpened into something religious. Stage was due 2 hours ago, Fletcher said, not stopping his pacing. He was built the way Montana winters required: broad through the shoulders, calloused hands, a jaw that seemed to have been set in argument with the world from birth. 2 hours late in a blizzard means something's wrong. Could mean the drivers got sense enough not to push through this kind of weather, Jesse said without looking up from his whittling. Driver's name is Cormac Briggs. Man doesn't own enough sense to fill a thimble. Fletcher reversed his circuit at the wall farm. He'd drive through the second coming if there was a schedule to keep. Then he'll get here, Caleb said from the window. His voice came out quieter than Fletcher's, deliberate in the way of men who'd learned early that volume was a poor substitute for conviction. At 32, Caleb carried the oldest brother weight in every line of his body and the set of his shoulders, the slight forward lean, the habit of placing himself between whatever was coming and whatever needed protecting. He'd been doing it since their father dropped dead of a heart seizure on a Tuesday morning 4 years back, leaving four brothers in 800 acres of Montana range and a mortgage that came due with the indifference of weather. "You're not actually calm," Reed said from his corner, not looking up from his coffee. "You're doing that thing where you stand very still so the rest of us don't panic." Caleb didn't respond, which was itself a response. The Iron Bend Ranch had been their father's dream, carved out of valley floor and ridge grass and 20 years of sustained stubbornness. Gideon Holt had arrived in Montana Territory in the summer of 1861 with $40 a wagon and a wife who'd read too many frontier stories to know better than to come. He'd built the main house with his own hands, expanded through 2 winters that should have killed lesser ambitions, and died believing the land would outlast him. It did. So did the debt. 4 men could not run 800 acres properly. 4 men could not turn a functional cattle operation into a thriving one. 4 men could cook meals that kept them alive and mend fences that kept the herd in and maintain the 10,000 small tasks that kept a ranch from collapsing entirely, but they could not build a future. Futures required families. Families required women willing to come out to the edge of the American map and make a life from what they found there. Caleb had spent 3 months writing letters. He was not by nature a man of eloquent correspondence. His sentences came out practical, a little blunt, structured around what he could offer rather than what he felt. But he'd revised those letters until they were honest without being frightening, and sent them through a matrimonial agency in Denver that matched frontier ranchers with women willing to relocate. 3 women had answered: Sarah Whitmore from Cincinnati, a school teacher who wrote in crisp, organized sentences that suggested a woman who valued order above sentiment and would make a fine partner, if not a particularly romantic one. Catherine Duffy from Cleveland, daughter of Irish immigrants who understood hard work the way other people understood breathing. And Pearl Jacobson from St. Louis, a baker's daughter whose letters arrived smelling of cinnamon and whose enthusiasm filled every line so completely it occasionally ran off the page. 3 women, 3 brothers to marry them. Caleb had exempted himself from the arrangement. He had his reasons, and they were the same reasons he'd given every time his brothers raised the subject. Someone had to maintain perspective, and perspective was harder to maintain when you were personally invested in the outcome. Fletcher called it cowardice. Caleb called it management. Either way, the women should have been here 2 hours ago. Horses. Reed set down his coffee and stood in a single motion. His voice was quiet but not tentative, the kind of quiet that came from someone who'd long ago chosen precision over volume. I hear horses. They moved together. It was the thing about the four of them, thing that people in Coldwater Creek remarked on. Sometimes the Holt brothers moved like something designed to function in groups coordinated in ways that didn't require communication. They had their coats on before conscious thought caught up to instinct, boots already on the boards pushing through the station door into a wall of cold that hit like something physical and meant it. The wind was doing its worst. Snow came sideways, each flake sharp-edged and personal in its insult. The temperature had dropped since morning with the purposeful aggression of a Montana November, and the moisture in Caleb's first breath outside crystallized somewhere between his lungs and the world. He squinted against the white and saw shapes resolving in the chaos, the particular darkness of horses, the angular mass of a coach, a driver perched high and wrapped in so many layers. He'd become a suggestion of a human being rather than one in full. Cormac Briggs climbed down with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints had opinions about cold and stomped toward them through knee-deep drifts with the expression of someone who'd been composing a speech for the last 2 hours. "Got your delivery, Holt," he called over the wind, gesturing back at the coach with something between resignation and amusement. "Though I'll say this ain't exactly the delivery I was expecting to make through a blizzard." Caleb felt the first thread of unease draw tight in his chest. "The women, are they all right?" "Women are fine. Women are better than fine, actually." Briggs pulled his hat down against a gust. "Women are something else entirely. Just brace yourself is all I'm saying." The coach door opened. The first woman who stepped down into the snow made Caleb forget briefly about the cold entirely. She was Chinese, small in frame but carrying herself with the kind of posture that made frame irrelevant, a straightness, a deliberateness that suggested steel worn beneath silk in the way that knives were sometimes carried hidden and perfectly balanced. Her hair had been arranged in an intricate style that the wind immediately set to work dismantling, sending dark strands across a face that revealed nothing. Not fear, not exhaustion, not the disorientation that should have been written all over anyone who'd just ridden through a Montana blizzard in a coach with no adequate heating. She wore a heavy American coat over what looked like traditional Chinese dress, practical boots, showing beneath embroidered fabric, where the coat didn't quite reach. When her eyes found Caleb's through the wind and snow, they were level, utterly steady. "I am Meilon," she said. Her English was careful, precisely weighted, each syllable placed with intention. "These are my sisters." 3 more women descended from the coach behind her. The second moved differently quick, assessing her eyes, cutting across every detail of the station. The brothers. The storm with the rapid calculation of someone who'd spent considerable time reading exits. She moved like someone who hadn't entirely stopped running. The third was quieter, holding a wrapped bundle against her chest, the way a person held something irreplaceable. And when she finally raised her eyes, Caleb noticed her fingers stained at the tips with what he'd later recognize as paint. The fourth was the youngest, perhaps 18 or 19, her youth showing not in softness, but in the quality of her determination, which still had the wide-eyed intensity of someone who hadn't yet learned to modulate it. No Cincinnati school teacher, no Irish daughter from Cleveland, no baker's daughter from St. Louis. 4 Chinese sisters. Fletcher found his voice first, which was characteristic. "There's been some kind of mistake. We were expecting 3 women." "Yes." Meilon's gaze moved across all 4 brothers with the calm efficiency of someone taking inventory. "We know." Then how Caleb started. "We were at the agency," the second sister said. Her English came faster, more colloquial, shaped by streets rather than schoolrooms. "In San Francisco, when your letters arrived, the women you expected, they heard talk about Chinese, about how some towns in Montana don't welcome us, how some men think we're less than—" She stopped herself, jaw setting. "They got scared, decided marrying strangers out here wasn't worth the risk if those strangers might turn on them for having Chinese neighbors." Jesse shook his head sharply. "That's not who we are." "You need wives," Meilon said, neither agreeing nor disputing. Something passed across her composed expression, a flicker of something more complicated, than the statement she'd made. "We need what you offered: land, distance, a new beginning." She paused. "There are 4 of us." "There are 3 of us who agreed to marry," Caleb said, keeping his voice even. "I excluded myself from the arrangement." "Then there will be 4 agreements instead of 3. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried a quality that brooked nothing. "We will not be separated. This is not subject to discussion. Either you take all 4 of us, or we return to San Francisco on the next stage." She let a beat fall. "There is no middle position." The wind filled the silence she left behind. Snow accumulated on 4 sets of shoulders, 4 hats the space of frozen ground between 2 groups of strangers who just had the ground shift under them without warning. Caleb looked at his brothers. Fletcher wore the expression of a man confronting a structural problem he hadn't designed and didn't understand. Reed's face showed something more careful, the particular stillness of someone turning a complex calculation behind impassive features. Jesse looked between the women and his brothers with an expression that wanted very much to be hopeful and didn't quite know if it had permission. None of them had signed up for this. None of them had prepared for Chinese sisters instead of American widows and baker's daughters. None of them had expected to be standing in a blizzard trying to force 4 women into a plan designed for 3. But the alternative sending them back, returning to Iron Bend and watching the dream of building something lasting die another degree. Watching the land his father had bled to claim sit empty of the future it had always been meant to hold. Caleb studied Melan's face in the driving snow. He'd learned over 4 years of holding things together to read the difference between stubbornness and necessity, between pride and something truer and more desperate underneath. What he saw in her face was both of those things, yes, but it was also courage of a particular kind, the kind that showed itself in the willingness to stand in a stranger's blizzard and negotiate rather than beg. He didn't know what they were running from. He didn't know yet that knowing would matter. "The ranch can support 4 families," he said. "That was always the long-term plan. I just intended to wait, let my brothers settle first before I considered my own situation." He met Melan's eyes. "You need distance from something. We need help building a future. Maybe those needs line up better than any of us expected." "Caleb," Fletcher said the word carrying about 6 different objections compressed into 2 syllables. "You have a better idea." Caleb turned to him. "Because the stage driver has a schedule and the storm isn't getting kinder, and I am fresh out of alternatives." Fletcher looked at the 4 women standing in the snow with more dignity than the situation warranted. And then he looked at the coach and the road disappearing into white chaos, and he said nothing, which was itself an answer. Caleb turned back to Melan. "We make a deal. You come to Iron Bend. You meet the same terms we agreed to with the women who weren't brave enough to come: legal marriages, equal partnership, equal claim to land and home. In exchange, you work with us to build something that lasts." He paused. "And you tell me eventually what you're running from." Melan held his gaze for a moment. Then she spoke rapidly in Chinese to her sisters, a consultation that Caleb couldn't follow, but that seemed, from the quality of the silence it occupied, to involve more than mere agreement. The second sister argued something back in quick, clipped syllables. The quiet one with the bundle said something softer. The youngest nodded with the conviction of someone who'd already made up her mind. 30 seconds, maybe less, but it felt like something essential being decided in a language he couldn't reach. "We accept," Melan said finally, "under the stated terms, all 4 marriages, equal partnership, equal claim." Her eyes stayed on his. "We will keep our names, our customs, and our bond as sisters. These things are not negotiable either." "I wouldn't ask them to be," Caleb said. Briggs, who had been watching this exchange from beneath the tower of his winter wrappings, with the expression of a man who had witnessed stranger things in his career but couldn't immediately name what they were, cleared his throat. "Agency settled the full fare before departure," he said. "All 4 passengers. Someone back in San Francisco knew you'd either take them or you'd have to explain why to a federal matrimonial broker." He tugged his hat down. "Figure the rest out on your own time. I got a storm to beat." The coach pulled away before any of them could think of a reason to stop it, taking with it the last theoretical option for anyone to change their minds. 8 people stood in the snow as the sound of hooves faded into the wind, and then there was nothing but the blizzard and the impossible arrangement they'd all just agreed to. Introductions. Caleb said because someone had to say something practical, or they were all going to stand here until they became snow-covered statues. Then we figure out horses and get moving before someone loses fingers to the cold. Caleb Holt. He gestured to each of his brothers in turn. Fletcher, Reed, Jesse. Meilon indicated her sisters. Shu Yin, 26. The quick-moving second sister lifted her chin. Lian, 24. The quiet one with the bundle offered a small nod. Fei, 19. The youngest smiled bright and involuntary, then controlled it. The ranch is 12 miles northwest, Caleb said, already moving toward the station's small stable. Jesse, get the mounts. I can ride, Shuyin said immediately. Fletcher raised an eyebrow. In this weather, I've ridden in worse. There was no bravado in it, just a statement of fact delivered by someone who didn't see the point of softening facts. Lian gets sick in wagons, Meilon added quietly. The motion. Horses would be better for everyone if it's possible. Caleb looked at his brothers. Reed had already started toward the stable. Fletcher shrugged with the resigned air of a man who'd run out of the energy required for objections. Caleb nodded. They were mounted inside 20 minutes luggage, secured to the two pack animals the stage station's hostler provided with the wordless efficiency of a man who'd seen frontier arrangements stranger than this, and would keep seeing stranger ones until he died. The storm had not improved its opinion of them. Wind hammered from the northwest with a personal intensity, and the temperature had dropped another several degrees while they'd been standing around making the kind of life decisions that were supposed to require more deliberation. Meilon swung into the saddle with practiced grace that caught Caleb's attention. So did Shu Yin. Even Lian, who had seemed the most fragile of the four, settled onto her horse with an ease that spoke of genuine familiarity. Your father had horses, Caleb said, not quite making it a question. In China before. Meilon's voice shifted slightly on the last word, a weight added and then deliberately set aside. Before we came to America. He didn't push. There would be time for histories later, assuming they survived the next 12 miles. Stay close, he said instead. Trail gets treacherous in this kind of snow. Lose sight of each other, and we could spend hours finding each other again. Or days. He glanced back at Fletcher. Or not at all. So nobody plays hero, Fletcher said flatly. We move together, we move careful, and we all make it home with our circulation intact. They rode out into the white chaos. The first hour was the worst. The wind had no patience for human ambition and expressed its contempt physically, driving snow into every gap between collar and skin, finding the place where a hat brim met forehead and making it its business. The horses moved with animal wisdom, testing each step, their instincts reading ground that human vision had surrendered entirely to the storm. Caleb rode point and navigated by memory by the subtle variations in the wind's behavior as it encountered landmarks he couldn't see, by the particular quality of the cold above frozen creek beds. 12 miles of Montana winter had to be crossed the way most of life's hardest ground got crossed, one deliberate foot at a time. He heard his brothers behind him, heard Fletcher calling out ice warnings, Jesse's voice cutting through gust roar, with reassurances, Reed's steady presence as rear guard. And between them, four women who had agreed in a blizzard outside a stage station to marry strangers in a place where the world had already decided whether or not to welcome them. An hour in, Lian's horse stumbled on a drift that concealed a buried fence post. The animal lurched sideways, and Reed was there before the stumble, finished his horse pressing close to steady the spooked mare. One gloved hand reaching out to catch Lian's reins with a steadiness that looked effortless and wasn't. Easy, Reed said, his voice cutting through the wind without needing to be loud. Just a drift. Everyone's fine. Lian looked at him. Something moved across her face, fear converting itself to gratitude with a rapidity that suggested she was more accustomed to the first than she'd been given reason to expect the second. She nodded, once recovered her reins, and rode on. 2 hours in, it was Fei who broke the wind-howled tension. She started laughing, bright, wild, entirely incongruous laughter that startled everyone within earshot into turning to look at her. I'm sorry, she managed, still laughing, her accent giving the apology a musical quality that fought the weather for dominance. It's only we crossed an ocean. We traveled for weeks. We survived so much, and now we are going to die in a snowstorm before we have even seen the ranch we are supposed to be saving. It is very funny. We're not dying, Jesse said immediately, moving his horse closer to hers. His voice was firm in the specific way that sincerity is firm, which is different from the firmness of performance. I promise you that. Caleb knows these trails the way he knows his own name. We are maybe another hour out. Maybe, Fei repeated, but she was still smiling. Definitely, Jesse corrected, and smiled back with the ease of someone who'd decided that smiling was the correct response to the situation, and had no intention of reconsidering. And then tomorrow, Shuyan called from her position near Fletcher, "We only have to navigate being married to complete strangers." "One disaster at a time," Fletcher replied. There was something in his voice, not warmth exactly, but the first small evidence that warmth was possible. 3 hours after leaving the station, Caleb spotted the first fence post. The particular darkness of Iron Bend's boundary markers spaced at intervals he'd walked and ridden so many times they existed in his body as a kind of internal cartography. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Almost home," he called back. 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes were longer than the previous 3 hours combined. The way arrival always expanded time made the last distance feel deliberately cruel. The cold seemed sharper now that warmth was theoretically close. The exhaustion that the body had been politely deferring presented its invoice all at once. And underneath both sensations, the awareness that what waited at the end of this ride was not rest or simplicity, but rather the beginning of something that none of them had adequately prepared for. Then the house materialized from the storm. 2 stories built by a man who'd intended it to house generations. The barns and outbuildings flanked the main structure like sentinels, and smoke rose from the chimneys in thick, promising columns that meant heat and shelter in the end of the wind. Caleb had seen that house 10,000 times in his life and had never before felt the sight of it with the particular combination of relief and apprehension that moved through him now. They got the horses inside the barn first. The animals deserved it, and the people needed the warmth of the work. Unsaddling, brushing down feed and water, the familiar physical grammar of ranch life that gave everyone something to do with their hands, while their minds caught up to what had just happened. In the lamplight of the barn, with the storm locked outside and the animals settled around them, Caleb got his first clear look at the women who had just upended everything. Maylon stood with her sisters gathered close, all 4 of them, supporting each other through the physical posture of people who'd learned that support had to be held in the body when it couldn't be put into words. Snow had melted in their hair. Their coats were soaked through. The exhaustion that their composure had kept politely off stage had finally shown up to claim what it was owed. But they were alive. They had made it. "Welcome to Iron Bend Ranch," Caleb said quietly. Maylon met his eyes. "Thank you," she said. And then after a small pause that felt like something breaking open in her careful self-possession, "Thank you for not sending us back." He gestured toward the house. "Let's get everyone warm. The rest of it, the arrangements, what comes next, all of it can wait until morning." Inside, Fletcher built the fires. Jesse disappeared into the kitchen and returned with bread and dried meat and a block of hard cheese that was better than nothing and considerably better than freezing. The 4 sisters stood in the main room and looked at what was going to be their home, and Caleb watched them see it. The cleanliness maintained through long habit, the spareness of men who'd never had reason to create beauty for its own sake. The functional loneliness of a space that had been endured rather than inhabited. "It's not much," he started. "It is safe." Maylon's voice was quiet but certain. "It is shelter. It is a beginning." She looked at her sisters, at the brothers, and then back at Caleb. "That is enough for tonight." They ate in the particular silence of people too tired and too overwhelmed for conversation. When the food was gone, the question of sleeping arrangements had to be navigated. "4 bedrooms upstairs," Caleb said. "You take them tonight. We'll manage down here by the fires." "That isn't fair," Faye protested. "It's one night," Jesse said gently, already pulling blankets from the storage chest. "Let everyone rest. Tomorrow we figure out the rest." Maylon looked at Caleb for a long moment. A look that was not gratitude exactly, but something adjacent to it, the kind of acknowledgement that passed between people who understood the weight of practical generosity without needing to elaborate on it. She nodded. The 4 sisters climbed the stairs together. Doors closed softly. Footsteps moved overhead, and then the house was quiet in a new way, full of people alive with the presence of 8 lives where there had been 4, breathing in the dark like something that had been waiting to start. The brothers stood in the main room looking at each other with expressions that covered a considerable emotional range. "Well," Fletcher said after a silence that had gone on long enough, "that happened." 4 Chinese sisters, Jesse added, sounding like a man examining a word he'd never expected to need in this combination. "We just agreed to marry 4 Chinese sisters we met 3 hours ago in a blizzard." "We agreed to marry 4 women we'd never met," Reed said. "The rest is details." "It's a significant detail," Fletcher muttered. "People in town are going to have opinions," Caleb said. He wasn't looking for arguments. He was looking to acknowledge it, name it, decide what to do with it. Some of those opinions are going to be ugly. People in town can mind their own business, Fletcher said with a firmness that surprised everyone, including Fletcher. We made a deal. Those women traveled across a continent on the strength of our word. We're not backing out because small-minded people might talk. Caleb looked at his brother. He'd expected the objections to keep coming. Instead, Fletcher had just arrived somewhere not all the way, but further than he'd started. Then we sleep, Caleb said, and we start figuring out the rest when morning comes. They settled by the fires in the practiced way of men who'd slept on harder surfaces for worse reasons. Sleep came eventually, though not quickly, not with 8 people in a house where there had been 4, not with an arrangement that had doubled itself in size and complexity without warning, not with the storm outside and the uncertain future inside. Caleb lay awake longest. He listened to the house settle the wind quarrel with the shutters, the distant sounds of the women finding rest in rooms that hadn't held them yesterday. He thought about the way Meilon had looked at him when he'd said he wouldn't send them back. He thought about what kind of necessity made 4 women cross an ocean to marry strangers in a territory where the cold alone could kill them. He thought about the things she hadn't said, the story underneath the story, the answer to the question he'd promised himself he'd ask when they were somewhere warmer. Outside, the storm worked on. Inside, the house breathed with more life than it had known in years. And somewhere upstairs, Meilon Zhao stood at the window of a room that wasn't hers yet, watching snow fall on land, that wasn't hers yet, pressing a bundle of papers against her chest with hands that had been steady all day and could finally in private afford to shake. The papers were from a man named Harlan Voss, and Harlan Voss believed he owned her. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let herself feel the fear for exactly 60 seconds. This was the discipline she'd developed crossing 2,000 miles of American territory. She gave herself the fear in measured doses like medicine, enough to stay sharp without becoming paralyzed. 60 seconds. Then she folded it back down somewhere deep in her chest where it lived alongside everything else she'd been carrying since her father died and left behind a debt that no daughter should have been expected to inherit. The bundle in her hands contained 4 documents. She had memorized each of them so thoroughly she could have recited their language verbatim in the dark. The first was a loan agreement allegedly signed by her father dated 8 months before his death, committing Chen Wei-ren to repayment of $6,000 at terms that guaranteed failure. The signature looked close to her father's hand. She'd studied it for hours trying to find the difference, and she had found it the way he'd always curved the final stroke of his family name, turning it slightly upward as though the name itself was reaching for something. In the document, Voss showed them the stroke curved down. Her father had always said that a man's signature was a private thing shaped by habit as unconscious as breathing. Someone had studied him carefully before forging that curve. The second document was the debt transfer agreement, the legal instrument real enough in its structure, if not in its legitimacy, that took a dead man's obligations and applied them to his surviving daughters in the form of what Voss's lawyers called service contracts. 12 years of labor, the term said, to discharge the debt. 12 years in which they would be housed and fed and supervised in service to Voss's business interests in San Francisco's financial district. The language was careful, almost gentle. It read like employment. It was not employment. She had understood what it was the night Voss came to their room above the laundry house with 2 of his men and a bottle of celebratory wine in a manner that made the hair on her arms stand up the way it stood up before lightning struck. She'd gotten her sisters out of that room before the wine was poured, and they'd been running in one form or another ever since. The third document was a marriage certificate, the one she'd signed along with her 3 sisters at the offices of the Denver Matrimonial Agency 4 days ago. Names, dates, the seal of the agency's bonded agent, the names of the 4 Holt brothers written in the careful bureaucratic handwriting of someone who'd spent their career in the business of making arrangements official, legal, binding under territorial law. This was the wall she'd built between her family and Harlan Voss. Whether it would hold was the question she hadn't allowed herself to fully face yet, because facing it required imagining what happened if it didn't, and that was a direction her mind refused to travel this late at night in a room that still smelled like other people's lives. The fourth document was a copy she'd made herself in a back room of the agency while the agent was occupied with her sister's paperwork. A full transcript of Voss's so-called service contracts annotated in the margins, with every inconsistency she'd found, dates that didn't align, signature variations, the name of a notary who she had since discovered had died 18 months before the date on the documents. She'd worked by lamplight with a borrowed pen and written until her hand cramped because evidence mattered, and she'd always known this fight might eventually require it. She tucked the bundle under the mattress in a flat cloth pocket she'd sewn into its lining before leaving San Francisco. Then she crossed to the window again and looked out at the snow still falling, still erasing the world below into clean white silence. 12 miles northwest of Coldwater Creek, at the far edge of a territory that Harlan Voss had never visited, behind 4 legal marriage certificates in a land where those certificates carried weight that her father's forged debt papers she hoped could not simply override. Maybe it was enough. Maybe it was enough distance, enough legal architecture, enough stubborn American frontier indifference to San Francisco's financial arrangements. She thought about Caleb Holt standing in the blizzard snow, building on his hat and shoulders, looking at 4 unexpected Chinese women with an expression that had moved through shock and consternation and landed finally on something that she could only describe as practical decency. He hadn't sent them back. He'd done the math on need and desperation and come down on the side of the people in front of him rather than the plan he'd made. That was not nothing. She didn't know him. She knew nothing about him beyond what the agency's brief dossier had contained: age, occupation. The dimensions of his ranch, a character reference from the county sheriff that read more like a ranching report than a personal assessment. She didn't know if he was kind or patient or honest. She didn't know if he was the sort of man who kept his word when keeping it became inconvenient. She knew that he hadn't sent them back. For tonight, in this room, in this house, at the edge of the world, that was the foundation she had to work with. She would build on it carefully. She would make herself valuable, indispensable, and impossible to send away, not because she was afraid of him, but because she understood that security was not given. It was constructed, and she was very good at construction. Her sister's sounds drifted through the walls. Shuyan's restlessness pacing a new room as she paced every new room, cataloging it, mapping it, locating every exit. Leon's soft breathing already slowing towards sleep with the trust that beautiful people had in their own exhaustion. Faye's voice barely audible, whispering something in Cantonese, a habit from childhood that returned when she was scared and trying to pretend she wasn't. Meilon went to the wall between her room and Faye's and pressed one palm flat against the plaster. Then she said in Cantonese the 3 words their mother used to say when the world felt too large and too cold and too indifferent: "We are here." Through the wall, barely audible, Faye's whispering stopped. Meilon returned to the window. Outside, the snow fell soft and indifferent and endlessly patient, the way Montana winters did, as though they had all the time in the world and weren't bothered by the small, fierce lives that moved through them. Tomorrow she would begin building the life that would protect all 4 of them. But tonight, for just this last quiet hour, she let herself stand at the window and feel not afraid, not calculating, not responsible for everything, just present, just alive. Just a woman standing at a window, watching snow fall on a piece of land that she had chosen with the deliberate and terrified courage of someone who understood exactly what choosing it might cost. Morning came to Iron Bend with the particular clarity that followed bad weather. A sky scoured clean and cold, the snow lying in luminous drifts that reshaped everything familiar into something that had to be relearned. Caleb woke before dawn, stiff from the floor in the inadequate blanket, and lay for a moment listening to the house breathe around him. Full house. It had been full before, when their father was alive, when their mother was alive, when Iron Bend had been a home rather than a maintenance project. But that fullness had been the familiar weight of family worn smooth by years. This was different. This was the weight of 8 lives that didn't yet know the shape of each other. He was building the fire back up when he heard the first footsteps overhead. His brothers woke in their usual sequence. Fletcher first, a morning person in spite of his fundamental disposition toward complaint. Reed next, moving from sleep to function with the seamless efficiency that characterized everything he did. Jesse last, requiring the combination of smell and sound that coffee produced before consciousness fully engaged. They moved through the morning rituals of the kitchen with practiced ease, pulling out provisions, setting the coffee on the newly built fire, finding the routine in a day that had nothing else familiar to offer. The sisters came downstairs 20 minutes later. In daylight, without the distortion of storm and exhaustion, and the specific unreality of finding 4 unexpected women in a blizzard, Caleb finally saw them clearly. They'd changed from their travel-stained clothes. Meilon wore a deep blue dress with her hair arranged in the careful style she seemed to maintain as a matter of discipline rather than vanity. Shuyin had braided her hair back and wore a practical dark skirt and jacket combination that suggested someone who'd thought carefully about freedom of movement. Lian came downstairs still carrying the wrap bundle, which she set on a table near the window, with a specific carefulness that made Caleb think of the way a person carried an injured limb. Faye was the last down and the only one who offered an immediate smile, small, still uncertain, but genuine. "Good morning," Meilon said, formally stopping in the doorway to the main room, as though she intended to wait for a formal invitation to proceed. "Coffee's ready," Caleb said. "Come in. This is your house, too." The words felt strange in his mouth, but strange in the way that true things sometimes felt when you said them for the first time. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. Like a word in a language you just started learning. They gathered around the table that their father had built to seat a family twice their current size. 8 people made it feel almost crowded in a way that was, Caleb realized, not unpleasant. Jesse poured coffee with tremendous concentration. Reed sliced bread. Fletcher found the preserves 2 jars of wild plum that their mother had put up the summer before she died, transferred year to year, to new shelves kept without anyone explicitly deciding to keep them. The sisters watched the brothers' domestic choreography with careful attention. They were learning, Caleb understood. Cataloging, mapping the geography of this new life with the systematic attention of people who didn't have the luxury of assuming things would work out. The storm dropped at least 2 feet, Fletcher said, breaking a silence that had grown long enough to become a presence of its own. "More in the drifts. Barn doors are probably blocked. Cattle need to be checked." "We can help," Shuyan said immediately. Fletcher turned to look at her with the expression of a man recalibrating a previous assumption. "That's heavy work, ma'am. Shoveling in these temperatures." "I have done heavier." Her voice was level, not aggressive, simply factual. "We are not guests waiting to be accommodated. We agreed to work. Let us work." "She's right," Meilon said. And though the words were quiet, they landed with the finality of something decided. "We will learn your ranch. We will pull our weight from the first day. This is what we agreed to." Caleb looked at Fletcher, who looked at Reed, who looked at Jesse, who shrugged with the philosophical acceptance of the youngest sibling who'd learned long ago that certain arguments were lost before they started. "All right," Reed said in his measured way. "After breakfast, we divide the work. Some dig out, some check the animals, some keep the house from going cold. Everyone rotates so everyone learns what needs learning. Nobody does anything alone until they know what they're doing." It was the most diplomatic solution available, which was why Reed had been the one to offer it. Caleb nodded before anyone could revise it. They worked through the morning with the peculiar, focused energy of people who needed to be busy. The barn doors required 40 minutes of concerted digging, everyone taking turns in a rotation that Meilon organized with efficient calm, 2 people shoveling, 2 resting switch every 10 minutes. Don't let anyone exhaust themselves. Inside, the cattle were restless but healthy, and the horses turned curious eyes on the new arrivals with the frank assessment of animals who reserved final judgment. Fletcher demonstrated the watering process to Shuyin with the careful instruction of a man who was discovering, against his previous expectations, that he was teaching someone who already understood most of what he was saying. Halfway through, he stopped. "You've worked stock before." "My father's family had a farm," Shuyin said, not looking up from the water trough she was helping clear of ice. "Before we came to San Francisco, before—" She stopped, started again. "Before, we knew animals, we knew work." Fletcher watched her for a moment. Then he picked up his own shovel and worked alongside her without further comment, which was, Caleb observed from across the barn, as close to respect as Fletcher Holt got before 10 in the morning. Midway through the morning, Meilon reappeared from the house with her coat on and her sleeves rolled up, having apparently conducted a thorough inventory of the kitchen and storage cellar in the time it took everyone else to deal with the barn. She found Caleb hauling feed bags and intercepted him with the directness that he was learning her characteristic mode. "Your stores are adequate, but organized poorly. You are running low on preserved vegetables. Potatoes, turnips, carrots at current usage, you will struggle by mid-February." "We make do," Caleb said. Making do is not the same as thriving. She pulled the door to the storage cellar open and gestured inside. "I have reorganized by category and season. I have made notes on what needs to be acquired when the weather allows travel. And I can make your current stores last considerably longer than they would have before I touch them if you allow me to manage the kitchen properly." He stood at the cellar door and looked at the interior, she was right, already more logically arranged than it had been when he'd last looked at it 2 days ago. "How long did that take you?" "An hour. The kitchen itself, perhaps another half hour." She looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite impatience, but was adjacent to it. This is what I do. I organize. I plan. I make resources extend further than they should. In San Francisco, I manage the household for a family of 4 with a budget that should have covered 2. Let me do this. It is useful. Caleb handed her the feed bag and said, "Kitchen's yours. Tell me what you need, and I'll get it when the road's open." Something shifted in her expression, brief, subtle, the satisfaction of a woman who'd offered a specific competence and had it accepted without being required to justify it first. Then she was already turning back toward the house list, apparently forming in her mind with the automatic precision of a dedicated accountant. The days that followed developed their own rhythms, the way days did, when necessity drove people together and proximity did the rest. Meals improved dramatically within the first week. The stews that the brothers had been producing and consuming as fuel rather than pleasure became under Malon's management actual food complex, warm, nourishing, in ways that spoke of someone who understood the relationship between what you ate and how you felt about being alive. The bread that emerged from the iron stove was the first bread Caleb had eaten in 4 years that tasted like something other than survival. "She's either a miracle worker or a witch," Jesse declared on the third evening, scraping his bowl with the focused reverence of a convert. "I'm not ruling anything out." "She's someone who knows what she's doing," Leanne said softly from her corner of the main room, where she'd claimed a chair near the window with the best light and was working on something with a brush and a small pot of ink. It was the most she'd said unprompted since their arrival. Everyone looked at her, and she looked back with the particular calm of a person who'd said precisely what they meant to say and saw no need to add to it. Shuyin and Fletcher had declared by the end of the first week a full and enthusiastic rivalry that neither of them would have characterized as affection, and both of them might have been using as a substitute for it. It started with fence line inspection, Fletcher explaining the territory's layout, Shuyin asking questions that consistently cut past his explanations to the underlying logic, then offering modifications to his methods that he refused on principle and then a day later quietly implemented. "She's going to get herself hurt," Fletcher told Caleb the morning after Shuyin had spent 4 hours in sub-zero cold helping repair a section of fence that ice had pulled from its posts. "She doesn't know her limits out here." "Has she reached them yet?" A pause. "No, but then maybe she knows them better than you do." Caleb kept his tone even. "Give her the same credit you'd give a new hand who showed up and worked harder than expected." Fletcher said nothing, which meant Caleb had won the argument. What he noticed in the days following was that Fletcher began riding slightly closer to Shuyin when they worked together, not crowding her, not directing her, but positioned in the specific way of a person who decided to be ready if ready was needed. He appeared to be entirely unaware that he was doing it. Reed and Leanne fell into something different, quieter, less declarative, built from proximity rather than either conversation or competition. Lion worked in the main room every morning, painting with the methodical attention of someone pursuing something necessary rather than decorative. She painted from memory, Caleb understood, watching from doorways he hoped she didn't notice. Mountains rendered in brushstrokes that suggested homesickness. Women in traditional dress caught in gestures of ordinary daily life. A garden behind a house that didn't exist in Montana. She was painting her history before it faded, preserving it the way Malon preserved food, with the discipline of someone who understood that things left unprotected disappeared. Reed would find reasons to be in the main room. He'd come in to read and stay to watch. One evening, Caleb heard his brother speaking quietly and Lion's softer voice responding, and realized they were discussing what she was painting, her explaining the images, Reed listening with the focused attention he brought to everything he considered worth understanding. "She's extraordinary," Reed told Caleb the following morning with a directness that was unlike him. He sounded slightly surprised by himself. "The paintings aren't just pictures, they're entire lives. She's painting people who are gone places she can't go back to, moments that don't exist anymore, except in what she makes of them." "What did she tell you?" "That her father loved beautiful things but couldn't hold on to them. That when he died, they lost everything, the house, the business, the life he'd promised them." Reed paused. "She said that painting is the only way she knows to keep something true." Caleb filed this information in the careful internal record he'd been building since their arrival, the one that told the story of 4 women who carried their past in their bodies, who moved through the world with the specific watchfulness of people who understood that safety was not a permanent condition. Jesse and Faye had become within days the accidental emotional center of the household. Faye laughed easily and without apology, finding comedy in her own mistakes and in the thousand small absurdities of frontier life that everyone else had long since stopped seeing. Jesse responded to her laughter the way he responded to most good things, by leaning toward it, by finding it generative, by becoming slightly more himself in its presence. They played cards in the evenings, Faye teaching Jesse Chinese games that he had no foundation to understand, and Jesse teaching her poker with the enthusiastic instruction of a true believer. "They're good for each other," Meilon said one evening, watching them from across the room while she mended one of Leanne's blouses. "Jesse makes Faye remember that the world can be funny. Faye makes your brother remember that being young is not a problem to be solved." Caleb sat across from her, coffee going cold on the table between them. Outside, wind moved through the pines with the restless quality of winter not quite finished with its opinions. "What about Shu Yin and Fletcher?" Meilon's needle paused, then resumed. "They are teaching each other something they didn't know they needed to learn." She glanced up briefly. "How to be wrong in front of someone who won't think less of you for it. They argue constantly." "Yes." A small pause. "That is what it looks like when people who are too proud to be vulnerable decide to let each other in through the side door." Caleb considered this. "Then you're very observant." "I am the oldest sister. Being observant is the same as being responsible. You learn to watch for what your family needs before they know they need it." She set down the blouse and looked at him directly. "I have been watching you too, Caleb Holt. What have you seen?" She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant thinking rather than evasion. "A man who carries more weight than he should alone. Who has made himself essential to everyone around him, because making yourself essential means no one can afford to lose you. Who says he excluded himself from the marriage arrangements for practical reasons, but who actually excluded himself because he has spent 4 years becoming afraid of wanting anything for himself." The accuracy of it landed somewhere between his ribs and stayed there. "That's a lot to see," he said, finally aiming for lightness, landing somewhere in the vicinity of exposed. "I told you, I watch carefully." Her expression wasn't unkind. If anything, it was careful with him in the way she was careful with valuable things. "You don't have to be afraid of this. Whatever it becomes, you are allowed to let it become something." He didn't know how to answer that, so he didn't, and the silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but honest. The kind of silence that happened after something true had been said, and both parties were deciding what to do with the truth now that it was in the room. 2 weeks after the sisters arrived, the roads finally cleared enough for the first trip to Coldwater Creek. The supplies Meilon had inventoried as insufficient were genuinely insufficient, and beyond that, Caleb understood the other necessity showing themselves in town, making the arrangement real in the eyes of the community that would have to live alongside it. He'd been delaying, and he knew it. "I'll go," he said at breakfast. "Anyone who needs to come speak now, I will accompany you." Meilon said it without asking, which was characteristic. People in town, some of them aren't going to be welcoming. She looked at him with an expression that held a very quiet impatience at the assumption that this was news. "I have been unwelcome in many places. I will survive it again." The ride to Coldwater Creek took 3 hours on roads that the snowmelt had rendered uncertain in specific places that required careful navigation. Meilon rode beside him and said little, but her attention was total, taking in the landscape with the systematic attention of someone building an internal map. She asked once about the terrain between a particular ridge and the creek that gave the town its name, and her question was specific enough that Caleb answered it fully, and she nodded once and added it to whatever she was constructing in her head. Coldwater Creek contained perhaps 300 people spread across a main street of commerce and a scatter of homesteads radiating outward to serve the surrounding ranches and the silver claims in the hills. It was neither welcoming nor hostile. As a place, it was what most frontier towns were, which was practical. It existed for trade, and most of what happened in it was governed by the economics of trade rather than any particular social philosophy. But it had people in it, and people had opinions. The attention started before the wagon stopped, curtains shifted, conversations paused, 3 separate groups on the main street turned to look with the particular pointedness of people performing the act of noticing. Caleb felt Meilon beside him and watched her feel it too, and watched her not react, and understood that this kind of performance, the performance of dignity under scrutiny, was something she'd been doing for a long time. Inside Price's general store, Edmund Price looked up from his counter as they came through the door, registered Meilon with a visible recalibration of his expectations, and looked at Caleb with a question he was apparently deciding whether to ask. "Caleb," he said with the careful neutrality of a businessman who'd learned that strong opinions were bad for commerce. "Ed." Caleb set the supply list on the counter. "Everything on there, plus whatever you'd recommend for finishing out the winter." Price took the paper. His eyes moved to Malon and back. "My wife," Caleb said, and the words came out more naturally than he'd expected, as though some part of him had already made the decision and simply hadn't notified the rest. "Malon Holt. She came in on the stage 3 weeks ago." Price's expression completed his journey from surprise through calculation to an approximation of courtesy. "Ma'am, welcome to Coldwater Creek. Don't believe I was aware of any wedding." "It was a private arrangement," Malon said with the calm precision of someone who had already composed this particular response. "Through a matrimonial agency in Denver. I and my 3 sisters are all recently married into the Holt family." She moved toward the shelves and began examining goods with professional interest, as though the conversation was settled and the next task was evaluation. "Your dry goods are well stocked, but your preserved produce is limited for this time of year. Do you receive regular deliveries when the pass is clear?" Price blinked. "Come spring, yes, stage brings goods twice a month." "Then perhaps we can discuss a trade arrangement. We'll have surplus garden produce by July, possibly earlier if the season cooperates. Fresh vegetables are worth more than their weight when everything else has been preserved for 6 months." It was the maneuver Caleb had watched her deploy in the kitchen and the barn, in every space she'd entered, converting a social moment into a practical exchange, transforming the discomfort of being evaluated into the neutrality of being useful. By the time Price had agreed to discuss the trade proposition in more detail come spring, his expression had shifted from guarded to thoughtful, and the conversation had moved from what she was to what she could do. They were loading the wagon when Dorothea Crane appeared. She arrived with the particular momentum of a woman who'd been watching from across the street and decided the moment required her accompanied by 2 other women who moved in her orbit with the careful coordination of smaller bodies around a gravitational center. Dorothea Crane ran the Coldwater Creek Ladies Charitable Association, organized the seasonal social events, and maintained the social taxonomy of the community with the devoted precision of a natural archivist. She was, in short, the person in town whose opinion traveled farthest and hardest. "Mr. Holt," she said with a smile that had more structure than warmth, "I don't believe we've been introduced to your companion." "My wife," Caleb said, "Mrs. Malon Holt." "How very unexpected." Dorothea's gaze moved over Malon with an assessment that was performing politeness while being something else. "We weren't aware you were planning to marry, and so exotically." Malon looked at her. Her expression gave nothing away. "I am Chinese," she said. "If that is what you mean?" Of course, of course. It's simply so unusual for our community. We do try to maintain certain standards here in Coldwater Creek. Certain cohesion. I'm sure you understand how important that is for a community to function well. I understand that some communities use the word cohesion to mean something rather specific," Malon said pleasantly. "I understand it very well, in fact." She turned to Caleb. "I believe we have everything we came for. The weather looks as though it may turn." She walked to the wagon and climbed in with the unhurried composure of someone declining an argument without appearing to notice there'd been one offered. Caleb followed jaw tight. As they pulled away, he caught a glimpse of Dorothea's expression, the particular pinch of someone who'd landed what she thought was a decisive blow and discovered her target had simply stepped aside. They rode in silence for a mile. Then Malon said, "She will be a problem." "Yes, but she is the kind of problem that solves itself if you outlast it." She adjusted the blanket across her lap against the cold. "People like her have influence because others defer to them. When others stop deferring, the influence diminishes. We simply have to give the others a reason to stop deferring." "And how do we do that?" "By being here, consistently, visibly, by building the kinds of relationships that make it awkward to dismiss us." She paused. "And by being good at things that matter. People will tolerate a great deal from someone they need." Caleb looked at her profile against the gray winter sky. "You've thought about this carefully." "I have been thinking about it since before we arrived," she said. "Since before we left San Francisco. Survival requires preparation. And this," she gestured slightly at the road ahead, at the implied landscape of the life they were building. "This is the kind of survival that takes years. You do not prepare for it the week it begins." The sleet that had been threatening since noon began as they reached the ranch, and they unloaded the wagon in cold rain that stiffened fingers and reduced conversation to essentials. Inside, the others gathered to sort supplies, and Malon recounted the trip in precise terms. Price's trade prospects, the quality of Price's inventory, omitting Dorothea Crane's performance, but not Caleb noticed forgetting it. That night, after the house had settled into sleep, he found Malon still in the kitchen. The lamp was low. She was preserving vegetables by the light it offered, cutting with the practiced efficiency of someone who found repetitive physical work useful for her mind. "You don't have to do that now," Caleb said. "My hands need occupation." She didn't look up. "My mind needs quiet. They are occasionally compatible conditions." He poured himself coffee and sat at the table, giving her the space of the room without entirely leaving it. After a while, the quality of the silence changed, and he recognized the change as deliberate. She was deciding something. "There is something I need to tell you," she said. The knife kept moving, steady and precise. "Something we should have told you before we arrived, but couldn't. Not over letters, and not until we knew whether you were someone who could be trusted with it." Caleb set down his coffee. "All right. We didn't come here only looking for a new life." She set down the knife and turned to face him, and what he saw in her expression was the careful, controlled fear of someone who'd been managing it for so long, they no longer quite remembered what it felt like to not manage it. "We came here running from a man. His name is Harlan Voss." She told him everything. The debt her father had accumulated, the forged documents, the service contracts that were not contracts, but claims of ownership. The night Voss came with his men and his wine, and the hours of flight across San Francisco, and then the long, terrified journey east, using the last of their resources to buy distance and time, and the legal protection of 4 marriage certificates. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "The documents are forged," he said. "I believe so. I have found inconsistencies, a dead notary, a signature variance on my father's name. But proving forgery takes lawyers' time, money. And Voss has all 3. "Yes. Does he know where you are?" "Not yet." Her eyes held his steadily. "He will look. Men like him always look. He is not someone who accepts loss quietly." Caleb looked at his coffee cup for a long moment. Then he stood. "You should have told me sooner," he said. And before she could respond, "Not because it changes anything, because you've been carrying this alone, and you didn't have to. Not here." She looked at him with an expression that had something fragile and unguarded moving across its surface. "We didn't know if we could trust you." "Do you know now?" "A beat. I think so." "Then we tell my brothers in the morning. Together. And then we start building the walls." He looked at her directly. "How much time do you think we have?" "Weeks, months perhaps." He is methodical. "Then we'll use the time." He reached out and briefly covered her hand where it rested on the counter, a gesture that was careful and deliberate and did not overstep the boundary of what was real between them yet. Whatever he tries, he's going to find out that Montana ranchers don't give up what's theirs. Malon looked down at their hands. Something moved through her that she couldn't entirely suppress, a slight loosening around the eyes, the specific expression of someone who has been held up by their own determination for so long that the offer of help is almost more than they know how to receive. "We are not truly yours," she said softly. "Not yet. You're on my land with my name." He withdrew his hand. "That's enough to start." She nodded once, and when he left her to her work, she stood for a long moment with her hand still resting on the counter where his had been, and whatever she was feeling showed only on her face in the empty kitchen with no one there to see it. Upstairs, her sister slept. Outside, the sleet turned back to snow, soft and silent, covering the world the way quiet covered difficult things, not erasing them, just giving them a gentler surface for a while. And somewhere in San Francisco, in an office on a street that never went entirely dark, a man named Harlan Voss opened a letter from a private inquiry agent he'd hired to find 4 missing women, and read the report with the calm, focused attention of someone who had never in his professional life lost a thing he'd decided to keep. He picked up a pen. He began composing his response. He was methodical. He was patient. And he was coming. The next morning, Caleb gathered his brothers in the barn before the women came downstairs. The cold was deep enough to make their breath visible, and he told them everything Malon had told him, in the same careful order she'd told it: the debt, the forged documents, the claim of ownership disguised as a service contract, and the man behind it all. Fletcher's face went through several iterations. He landed on a kind of hardened certainty that Caleb recognized as his brother's particular version of loyalty, the version that didn't ask whether something was convenient before it committed. Reed went still in his particular way, processing. When he spoke, it was careful and unsentimental. If Voss has documents from a California court, they carry weight here regardless of whether they're legitimate. We'd need to contest them formally, which requires a judge, which requires time, which requires Voss not to get to lay in the interim. So we get ahead of it, Jesse said. His voice was bright with an anger that he was directing productively toward the practical. We make sure the marriages are filed officially with the county clerk. We get our names in every official record that matters. We make sure everyone in Coldwater Creek sees them as our wives before anyone from San Francisco shows up to say otherwise. People in town already have doubts, Fletcher said flatly. Dorothea Crane will make sure of that. Then we make sure the people whose doubts can be resolved see enough to resolve them. Caleb looked at his brothers. We go to church Sunday. All of us, together. We walk in the front door and we sit down and we stay after to talk to people, and we do it every Sunday until it's normal. Fletcher raised an eyebrow. That's your plan. Part of it. The other part is that I'm going to see Judge Calloway and Sheriff Tuck this week and brief them on what's coming. If Voss shows up with papers, I want both of them to already know there's reason to question those papers before they read a word of them. The silence that followed held the weight of what none of them was saying directly, which was that this might not be enough, that a wealthy, connected man with forged documents and expensive lawyers might be more than a Montana ranch family could stop through planning and community relationships alone. Reed was the one who said it out loud because Reed was always the one who said the thing. What if preparation isn't enough? Then we do what Pa would have done, Caleb said. We stand our ground and we don't back down. And we make sure that whatever Voss tries, he's walking into something he didn't expect. They told the sisters together after breakfast. The four women heard the plan the way they heard most things seated close together at the table, their faces giving different versions of the same controlled reaction. Shuyan's hands closed into fists. Leanne's expression went distant, the way it did when she retreated to the interior place where she could paint things into safety. Faye moved closer to Mahlon, and Mahlon received her without looking away from Caleb, without allowing her composure to fracture. You should have been told immediately, Reed said to Leanne specifically, and something in his voice was not quite an apology but was shaped like one. We told you as soon as we trusted you enough, Mahlon said, answering for all of them. That is the honest truth of it. How do we prepare, Shuyan asked, with the directness of someone who found comfort in action rather than reassurance. We make ourselves impossible to dismiss, Caleb said. Here and in town, we build the kind of presence that makes sending you back politically and legally complicated. Shuyan looked at him for a moment, then nodded once, the nod of a person deciding to trust a strategy they hadn't designed. Then we start today. And they did. Over the following weeks, the preparation was systematic and quiet and relentless. Caleb and Fletcher rode to town and filed the marriage certificates with the county clerk, who recorded them with the practiced indifference of a man who had recorded stranger things and would record the stranger things still before his career was finished. Caleb visited Sheriff Grady Tuck, a lean, deliberate man, with the long patience of someone who'd spent 2 decades watching the frontier accumulate complications and laid out the full situation without softening any of it. Tuck read the description of Voss's claim documents with a lawman's eye. He's careful, he said. Nothing in what you're describing is obviously illegal on its face, but nothing in what you're describing is obviously legitimate either. He handed back Caleb's notes. I can't stop him from arriving. I can't ignore court papers if he brings them. But I can insist on thorough verification before any action is taken, and I can make it very clear that taking anyone against their will is kidnapping under territorial law, regardless of what pieces of paper he's holding. Judge Calloway proved thornier and more valuable. He was 60, weathered, possessed of a face that had witnessed the gap between what law said and what law did often enough to have developed a strong personal opinion about that gap. He listened to Caleb for an hour without interrupting. When Caleb finished, Calloway said, "Bring me proof of the forgeries. Whatever she has, the inconsistencies, the dead notary, the signature analysis. I can't rule on documents I haven't seen, but I can refuse to process anything that doesn't hold up under scrutiny, and I can make sure no one is removed from my territory without due process." He met Caleb's eyes. I won't let someone be dragged out of here because a rich man in California forged their dead father's name on a piece of paper. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a wall, another one. Meanwhile, the sisters built walls of their own, and these were perhaps more durable than legal filings. Mahlon's negotiations with Edmund Price had progressed from provisional to genuine by the third week. The trade arrangement they'd sketched out had taken on specific terms, and Price, who understood value better than he understood ideology, had begun referring to her in conversations as the Holt woman who knows commerce. It wasn't warmth, but it was the particular respect that commerce cultures developed for competence, and it was a beginning. Faye at the Thursday reading circle that Sarah Price organized in the back room of the general store arrived with the specific combination of genuine curiosity and unself-conscious warmth that made people either adore her immediately or find her exhausting. 3 women adored her, 2 were working on it, and one, a young woman named Clara, who'd arrived from Ohio 6 months ago and hadn't yet found her footing, looked at Faye with the specific recognition of someone who'd also been new somewhere and scared and was relieved to find it was survivable. Reed had documented everything: the marriages, the work, the community interactions, testimonials gathered from Price and from Tom Aldrich, the cattleman who'd done business with the Holt Ranch for 8 years, and was prepared to say in writing and before any judge that the Holt brothers were men of their word and their wives were women of character. The documentation had the systematic quality of Reed's everything. Nothing excessive, nothing omitted, every piece connected to every other piece in a way that told a coherent story that would be difficult for a court to dismiss. And beneath all of it, beneath the preparation and the planning and the community building, the thing that was actually happening at Iron Bend was simpler and more important than any of it. 8 people were becoming a family, not in the legal sense, which had already been accomplished, not in the declared sense, which would come later, but in the daily accumulated sense, the one that was built from 100 small moments of choosing each other when choosing wasn't required. Fletcher and Shu Yin arguing across a fence line in the particular tone of people who'd discovered they could argue and not break. Reed sitting beside Leanne while she painted, reading aloud, because she'd asked him to once, and he'd understood immediately that it wasn't the book she wanted. Jesse teaching Faye to bake cornbread and learning in the process more Chinese vocabulary than he'd expected to need. And Caleb, at the end of long days, finding his way to the kitchen, where Mahlon was always the last one awake, and sitting across from her in the lamplight, building slowly and carefully the architecture of something that neither of them had entirely planned for. On the 40th day after the sisters arrived, a letter came from San Francisco. Caleb recognized the quality of the paper before he recognized the name on the return address. It was the kind of paper that announced its own importance, heavy cream-colored, formal in the way that weapons were sometimes formal. He took it from Edmund Price's counter and drove a mile out of town before he opened it, because whatever it said, he didn't want the reading of it to be a public event. The letter was from Harlan Voss. It was polite in the precise way of a document written by someone who understood that politeness and threat were not incompatible. It informed Caleb Holt that the 4 women currently in his household were subject to legitimate debt obligations, that the marriages they had contracted were potentially voidable under California law as having been entered into specifically to evade those obligations, that Voss intended to arrive in Coldwater Creek in 2 weeks' time to resolve the matter with the cooperation of the relevant parties, and that he expected to find that cooperation forthcoming. The final paragraph suggested with a calm that was somehow worse than anger would have been that uncooperative parties should be aware that his legal resources were considerable and his patience, while substantial, was not infinite. Caleb read it 3 times. Then he folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and drove home to tell his family that the storm they'd been preparing for had finally sent its advance notice. 2 weeks. It wasn't much time, but it was time, and they had built a great deal with less. The letter changed the atmosphere at Iron Bend the way a change in barometric pressure changed the atmosphere before a storm. Nothing visibly different, but everything weighted differently. The air had a new density. The ordinary tasks of ranch life continued, but they continued with the particular sharpness of people who understood that ordinary might be temporary. Caleb shared the letter at the dinner table, reading its key points aloud in a voice that kept itself level, because someone's voice had to be. The sisters received it the way they received most hard news together, arranged unconsciously into the unit they'd been since childhood. Mahlon as its center, the others arrayed around her with the instinctive geometry of a family that had learned to weather things in formation. 2 weeks, Shu Yin said when he finished. Not a question, a measurement. He'll use every day of it, Mahlon said. Her voice was very calm. Caleb had come to recognize this quality of calm. It wasn't serenity, it was the specific emotional temperature of someone running a precise internal calculation. He won't arrive unprepared. He'll have spoken with attorneys about territorial law. He'll know what arguments to make. Then we know what arguments to counter, Reed said. Some arguments can't be countered, Leanne said quietly. She hadn't looked up from her hands. Some arguments are made by men with money and connections, and the answer to those arguments is more money and more connections, and we don't have those. We have something better, Jesse said. What? We have a territory where the people who matter actually know us. He looked around the table reading faces. Voss is coming from San Francisco with papers and lawyers. We've been here for 6 weeks building relationships with the sheriff and the judge and half the ranchers in the county. He's coming into our ground. Faye looked at her youngest sister with something that was equal parts calculation and hope. It was Caleb thought the most adult expression he'd seen on her face. Jesse is right, Malon said finally. But we don't wait for him to arrive to determine the outcome. We use the 2 weeks every day. The preparation that followed had the focused quality of a campaign conducted by people who understood that their options were limited and their margin for error was not. Caleb spent 2 days riding county roads visiting every rancher he'd done business with in the last decade, not asking for help explicitly, but describing the situation in plain terms and letting the ranchers draw their own conclusions. 3 families offered to be present in Coldwater Creek during the week of Voss's expected arrival without needing to be asked for more specifics. Tom Aldrich, who'd raised cattle alongside the Holts since Caleb was 12, looked at him across a fence post and said, "You need bodies at your back. You send word, Harlan," with the flat finality of someone who'd already made the decision and was just putting language to it. Malon assembled her documentation. The bundle she'd carried from San Francisco came out from under the mattress and spread across the kitchen table, and she walked Caleb through it piece by piece: the loan document with the wrong signature curve, the service contract with its impossible notary stamp, the annotated copy she'd made herself with every inconsistency marked. Reed sat with her for 3 hours going through the materials and adding his own legal analysis, cross-referencing what she'd found against the territorial law he'd been studying since the letter arrived. The dead notary is significant, Reed said. If the document is dated 18 months after the notary died, that's not an inconsistency, that's proof of forgery. We need to establish the death date officially. I wrote to the San Francisco Municipal Records Office 3 weeks ago, Malon said with the quiet composure of someone who'd already thought several moves ahead. I asked for confirmation of the date of death of a notary public named Albert Chen, no relation, who I said I needed for a legal proceeding. It was true. If the response arrives before Voss does, it becomes evidence, Caleb finished. She nodded once. I am not only running one, she said, I have been building the case while we run. You learn to do both at once. He looked at her for a long moment. How long have you been doing this? Since the night we left San Francisco. She gathered the papers with the precise movements of someone who'd handled them many times. Every hour I was not moving us forward, I was working on how to stop him permanently. Because surviving Voss was never going to be enough. He would keep coming until there was a legal mechanism that made coming pointless. You planned this. I planned as much as I could. Her expression shifted slightly, not quite vulnerable, but less armored. There are things I couldn't plan for. Whether you would believe us, whether the judge would be honest, whether the people in this territory would see us as human enough to protect. She looked at him. I couldn't plan for those. I could only hope. The Sunday before Voss's expected arrival, all 8 of them rode to the First Community Church of Coldwater Creek. It was the second Sunday they'd attended. The first had been an exercise in endurance marked by enough pointed silence and performative ignoring to make its hostility legible from across the room. This Sunday felt different. The preparation they'd done in the intervening week had built something in the community that wasn't acceptance yet, but was the terrain that acceptance grew from. Edmund Price nodded to Malon as they entered. Sarah Price, who organized the Thursday reading circle, made room in her pew for Faye with a naturalness that wasn't entirely natural, but was practiced enough to be its own kind of progress. Tom Aldrich shook Caleb's hand at the door and kept his hand extended until Shu-Yin and Fletcher had both passed through his presence on the threshold, a statement that was read correctly by everyone who saw it. Dorothea Crane was there, of course. She was always there. She was the kind of woman for whom church was not worship, but administration. and she administered it with the precision of someone who understood that social capital was built and spent in exactly this kind of space. Her expression when the whole party entered was composed into something that resembled tolerance and communicated something else. The sermon was about standing firm in the face of adversity. Whether this was coincidence or the minister's particular reading of the moment, Caleb couldn't determine, but he watched Mahlon's face as the words were preached and saw something settle in her expression, a small solidification, as though the language was adding something to the structure she was building in herself. Afterward, in the milling social half-hour that followed, services Dorothea materialized at Mahlon's elbow, with the precision of a woman who'd been calibrating her approach since the processional hymn. "Mrs. Holt," she said with a smile that was doing considerable work, "I've been meaning to speak with you. I understand you've been attending the Thursday reading circle." "I have," Mahlon said. "It's been very pleasant. Mrs. Price is a generous host. Indeed, though I wonder if you found it comfortable. Given certain cultural differences, I only ask because we care about everyone feeling at home." "I feel entirely at home," Mahlon said with a pleasantness so complete it left no purchase for argument. "The reading circle has been one of the nicest parts of settling in here. Your community has been very welcoming in so many ways." She paused. "Present company included, of course." Dorothea blinked. Something flickered in her expression, the specific confusion of a person who'd landed a blade and found it had passed through without resistance. "How lovely," she said after a beat, "isn't it?" Mahlon turned to answer a question from Clara, the Ohio woman who'd appointed herself Faye's informal guide to frontier social customs, and the conversation with Dorothea was simply over as neatly as a book closing. Caleb, watching from a respectable distance, felt something that took him a moment to identify. It was admiration, uncomplicated and genuine. He was watching a woman who had crossed an ocean and two-thirds of a continent to arrive in a place that had already decided whether to welcome her, and who was rebuilding that decision one conversation at a time with the patient precision of an architect. Sheriff Tuck appeared beside him. "She's something," Tuck said without preamble. "Yes," Caleb agreed. "Word came this morning." Tuck's voice dropped and Caleb felt the back of his neck tighten. "Stage station in Billings got a reservation. Party of 4 booked for Coldwater Creek, arriving Thursday. 1 Harlan Voss, 1 legal associate, and 2 personal staff. 4 days. 4 days." Tuck looked out across the churchyard with the thoughtful expression he wore when he was deciding how to position pieces on a board. "I've been in contact with the federal marshal's office, sent a letter describing the situation, specifically the possibility of fraudulent documents and an attempt to claim ownership of Montana territorial residents. Got a response yesterday." He reached inside his coat. "They're sending someone." Caleb took the letter and read it. A federal investigative agent named Whitmore, currently operating out of the district office in Helena, would arrive in Coldwater Creek no later than Wednesday. His brief was to evaluate claims of document fraud affecting immigrant populations in Montana Territory, with specific attention to California-originated debt instruments of questionable legitimacy. "How did you—" "Turns out your situation isn't unique," Tuck said, taking the letter back. "This Voss, or men like him, it's a pattern. San Francisco has a particular problem with this kind of arrangement. You push some money to the right people, you forge some documents with the right notary seal, and you end up owning people who can't afford to fight you in court." His jaw set. "The marshal's office has been building a case for a year. Your wife's documents might be the piece that makes it complete." Caleb stood with this for a moment. The horizon of the fight had just shifted. What had felt like a defensive action was becoming something larger, with implications that went beyond Iron Bend and its 8 inhabitants. He went home and told Mahlon. She received the news about Agent Whitmore with less surprise than he expected, and then he understood why she had anticipated something like this. The annotated documents, the letter to the San Francisco Municipal, records the systematic preservation of evidence that she'd been conducting since before she arrived. It was all building toward this. She'd been preparing a legal case, not just a personal defense. "You knew there might be an investigation," he said. "I hoped." She looked at the kitchen table. "I wrote letters to 3 different offices over 2 months. I described the pattern without naming us specifically, and I described what I believed was a larger operation. I didn't know if anyone would respond. Someone did? Someone did." Something moved across her face, relief perhaps, or the particular weariness of a person who has been holding things together through sheer will and has just received the first evidence that help was coming. "I needed the law. Not just our local law, which is limited, but federal authority that Voss's California connections can't reach. Why didn't you tell me you'd written those letters? She met his eyes because I didn't know if you would have approved, and I couldn't afford to stop. He thought about this. I would have approved. I know that now. She almost smiled. I didn't know that then. The Wednesday before Voss arrived, Agent Whitmore rode into Coldwater Creek on a gray horse, carrying a weathered satchel, in the compact, deliberate manner of a man who'd learned to read situations faster than most people learn to read rooms. He was perhaps 55, with a face that had been made interesting by time rather than preserved against it. He met with Caleb, Sheriff Tuck, and Judge Calloway for 2 hours in the judge's chambers, and then he came to Iron Bend. Mahlon had prepared for this meeting with the same systematic attention she brought to everything that mattered. She sat at the kitchen table with her documents arranged in the specific order she'd decided during 2 weeks of private preparation, and she presented her evidence to Whitmore the way she'd presented the kitchen inventory to Caleb on their second morning, methodically, completely without asking permission to be thorough. Whitmore listened. He asked precise questions. He examined each document with the attention of someone who'd seen many forged papers and could feel the difference between authentic and constructed in the texture of the paper, the distribution of ink, the way the words sat on the page. When she reached the notary's stamp, he looked at it for a long time. Albert Nguyen Chen, he said, died November 14th, 1877. Your document is dated February 3rd, 1879. Yes, that's a 14-month gap. He set the document down with care. And you found this independently. I have been looking for inconsistencies in these documents since the night we left San Francisco. She folded her hands on the table. I have had considerable time to look. Whitmore looked at her for a moment, not in the assessing way that people had been looking at her since she arrived in Montana, weighing her novelty against their comfort, but in the professional way of a man who was recognizing specific competence. How many other inconsistencies did you find? She had found 11. She walked him through all of them. When she finished, the kitchen was very still. Caleb, standing in the doorway, watched Whitmore close his satchel with a snap that sounded decisive. I'm going to need copies of all of this, Whitmore said, and I'm going to need your testimony and your sister's testimony regarding the circumstances under which these documents were presented to you. We can provide that, Mahlon said. I can tell you informally that what you've assembled here is consistent with 3 other cases I'm investigating. Same paper stock on the loan documents, same pattern of impossible notary dates, same structure of service contracts. He looked at her steadily. I believe you, Mrs. Holt, and I believe that when Voss arrives Thursday, he's going to discover that the situation has changed considerably since he sent that letter. Mahlon absorbed this with absolute stillness. Then she nodded once slowly with the controlled relief of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just been told they could set it down, not yet, but soon. Thank you, she said. Thank you, Whitmore replied. You've done the work here. I'm just following it to its conclusion. That evening, for the first time since their arrival, Mahlon left the kitchen before midnight. Caleb found her on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, looking at the April stars that had appeared as the clouds broke and the night turned cold and clear. You should sleep, he said. Not yet. She didn't turn from the stars. I have been waiting for a night when I could look at the sky without thinking about what was coming. I wanted to try it. He stood beside her. Above them, the Milky Way was a broad burn across the dark, the way it only looked this far from city light, extravagant and ancient. How is it? He asked after a while. She breathed in slowly. Very large, she said, very still. Another breath. Very much not about Harlan Voss. He laughed low and quiet, and after a moment she did too, and the sound of it was different from the careful, composed sounds she usually made, lighter, surprised by itself, genuine. They stood together in the cold until she was ready to go inside, and he didn't rush her, and she didn't apologize for taking the time, and in the space between them something continued building that neither of them had yet named directly, but both of them had stopped pretending wasn't there. Thursday came gray and cold, with high cloud and a wind from the northwest that carried the threat of late-season snow. By 9 in the morning, Tom Aldrich and 2 of his ranch hands had appeared at Iron Bend without being asked, tying their horses at the post with the wordless solidarity of men who'd decided something and weren't going to discuss it. By 10, a second rancher named James Colquitt had ridden up. By 11, 8 people were prepared at Iron Bend, and another 6 were gathered at points along the road into the property, not visible from a distance, simply present. The black carriage appeared on the road at 12:30 noon. Caleb saw it from the barn roof where he'd climbed to check the storm weather. The particular glossy darkness of a city-made vehicle built for impression rather than frontier practicality. He came down and rang the bell, and within 4 minutes, all 8 of them were assembled in front of the house, arranged without anyone directing it in the particular order of a family that had developed over 6 weeks its own instinctive geometry. The carriage stopped at 40 paces. The driver climbed down and opened the door with the elaborate courtesy of a man paid specifically for that kind of thing. Harlan Voss stepped out onto Montana ground. He was, Caleb thought, exactly what the letter had suggested. A man of 50 or so who wore his wealth the way other men wore armor, each detail of his clothing and bearing calculated to communicate that the world arranged itself for him rather than the other way around. He moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who'd spent decades making others wait and had no experience of being made to wait himself. His eyes swept the assembled group with flat assessment, the brothers, the sisters, the unfamiliar faces of ranchers who had no obvious reason to be here and came to rest on Melan with the particular quality of someone inspecting something they'd come to collect. "Mr. Holt," he said, his voice was cultured, almost pleasant. "I presume. I'm Harlan Voss from San Francisco. I trust you received my letter." "I did," Caleb said. "I'm telling you what I would have written back. There's no claim to resolve here. These women are Montana territorial residents with legal marriages properly filed. Whatever business you think you have, your business is finished." Voss produced a leather folder from inside his coat with the unhurried gesture of someone making a point through the deliberateness of their movement. "I'm afraid it isn't that simple. I have documents properly executed, legally binding, establishing debt obligations incurred by the late Chenwei rent obligations, which transferred to his surviving daughters under the terms of the original agreement." He opened the folder. "It's all very properly arranged." "Debts don't transfer to children," Fletcher said. "That's not how law works. It is when the debts are secured against future consideration of family members, as was common practice in certain informal lending arrangements within immigrant communities." Voss's tone was patient, as though explaining something to someone only partly educated. "My legal counsel has reviewed these documents thoroughly." "Then your legal counsel reviewed them for you," Reed said with the quiet precision of someone who has a great deal to say and is selecting his words with surgical care. Because void contracts don't become valid through repeated review. Voss's second man had emerged from the carriage older, carrying the leather satchel of a working lawyer. He stepped forward now with papers extended. "These marriages were entered into specifically to avoid legitimate debt obligations," the lawyer said. "Under California law, marriages contracted for the explicit purpose of evading legal commitments are potentially voidable. I have a preliminary injunction." A new voice cut across the yard from the road. "That injunction is currently under federal review and cannot be enforced until verification is complete." Agent Whitmore came up the road on his gray horse with Sheriff Tuck riding beside him, and the sound of additional horses following behind suggested they had not come alone. Tuck's expression had the particular satisfaction of a man who'd been wanting to say something for several days and had timed the moment deliberately. Voss turned. Something moved in his expression, calculation replacing confidence. The specific recalibration of a man encountering a situation that hadn't been in his model. "And you are," he asked Whitmore. "Federal Investigative Agent, Helena District Office." Whitmore produced his credentials with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it often. "I've been examining debt instruments originating from San Francisco that have been used in Montana Territory and 3 other western states to claim ownership of immigrant residents. Your name has appeared in multiple case files, Mr. Voss." He opened his satchel. "I'd like to look at those documents you're carrying." "This is harassment," the lawyer said immediately. "My client has done nothing." "Your client has done something," Whitmore said, still pleasant. "And I can now demonstrate that with 11 separate evidentiary inconsistencies in the documents he's presenting, including a notary stamp from a man who died 14 months before the document's stated date." He looked at Voss. "That's not a procedural problem. That's forgery. You are welcome to present your papers to Judge Calloway, who's already been briefed, but I'd strongly suggest you consult with your attorney before deciding whether to proceed, because the ground here is considerably different from what you arrived expecting." The silence that followed had a particular quality. The silence of a man who had come a very long distance to collect something and was realizing for perhaps the first time in his professional life that what he'd come to collect was no longer available. Voss looked at Melan. She looked back at him with an expression that was neither triumphant nor afraid. It was simply clear. The expression of someone who has nothing left to hide from because they have already shown everything. I have a court order, Voss said after a pause that had been too long, from a federal judge which will be reviewed by Judge Calloway before any action is taken, Tuck said flatly. In this territory, territorial courts review before they enforce. That's the law, Mr. Voss, which means your party is welcome to proceed to Coldwater Creek and present your papers formally, and they will receive formal consideration. He paused, at which point Agent Whitmore will also present his materials, and we'll see whose papers hold up. Voss looked at the assembled people around the house, the brothers in their arrangement of quiet solidarity, the sisters standing together, the ranchers at the fences who hadn't moved and hadn't needed to, the federal agent who had arrived from nowhere with a satchel full of counter-evidence. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man performing a calculation he didn't like the answer to. He straightened his coat. He smoothed his expression back to its default surface of composed authority. Very well, he said. We'll proceed through the proper channels. He looked at Malon one last time, and what was in his eyes was not defeat, it was the specific patience of a man who believed in the long game. This isn't resolved, he said. No, Malon agreed quietly, but it has begun to resolve. That will have to be enough for today. The carriage turned on the road and moved away toward town with Tuck and Whitmore following at a deliberate distance, and the sound of hooves faded, and then the Montana wind moved through the silence, and the 8 of them stood together in front of Iron Bend and breathed. Lynn sat down on the porch steps. Her legs had given her an honest opinion about the last hour, and she'd accepted it. Jesse crouched beside Faye, who was shaking in the specific way of someone who'd been very still through something very frightening, and was now allowing their body to process what it had been denied. We're okay, he said. You're okay. Faye nodded, still shaking. I know, she said. I just need a minute. Take whatever you need. Shuyin stood beside Fletcher, not quite touching him, and stared at the road where the carriage had been. Her expression was unreadable, which was its own kind of statement. After a moment, Fletcher said something too quiet to hear, and she turned to look at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her exhale a long, slow release of something that had been held a long time. And Malon. She stood for a moment with her back to the house and her face toward the road, and her eyes closed, and Caleb watched her and understood that she was giving herself the 60 seconds she always gave herself. The fear in its measured dose, taken processed, returned to its designated place. When she opened her eyes, she looked at him. He'll try again, she said. Yes, in court this time, with lawyers. Yes, she nodded slowly. Then we prepare for that too. We will. He stepped toward her and stopped at the right distance and said, but not today. Nay. Today you're allowed to let it be enough. She looked at him for a long moment. Then quietly she leaned forward and pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder. Just that touch, that small claiming of the human comfort that strength had been making her postpone. And then she straightened and turned toward the house and said in her normal voice, I'll start dinner. And the ordinary afternoon of Iron Bend resumed. Behind her, Caleb stood in the April wind and felt something shift in him that had been held in place since the moment he'd seen that first black carriage on the road. A tension releasing a wall that had been built against feeling too much coming gently down. Not over yet, but begun. And sometimes that was everything. The hearing before Judge Calloway took place 3 days after Voss's arrival at Iron Bend. 3 days in which Voss and his lawyer occupied rooms at Coldwater Creek's single boarding house and conducted themselves with the particular careful composure of people who understood they were being watched and intended to provide nothing worth watching. They met with Calloway's clerk. They reviewed documents. They sent 2 telegrams to California addresses. Whatever they were planning, they planned it behind closed doors with the professional efficiency of people for whom courtroom maneuvering was an ordinary day's work. Whitmore spent those same 3 days doing something different. He rode county roads. He spoke with people. He compiled the kind of record that required presence rather than paper conversations with residents who'd interacted with the Holt family in the past 6 weeks. Statements from Price and Aldrich and Clara, the Ohio woman who'd become Faye's friend and had apparently rather pointed opinions about what kind of person deserved to have their life claimed as collateral. He produced documents from his satchel in the evening's records from 3 other territories, testimonies from 8 other families, whose situations bore a structural resemblance to the one facing Iron Bend. He's building a pattern case, Reed said the night before the hearing, sitting with Whitmore at the kitchen table over coffee and spread documents. It's not just about us. It never was just about you, Whitmore said. You're the clearest evidence I have because Mrs. Holt did the work of documenting it. But this scheme has been running for 3 years across 4 Western territories. Dozens of families. He looked at the table. The question was always finding documentation that a judge couldn't dismiss. Forgery is hard to prove with single instances. It becomes undeniable as a pattern. Reed looked at the documents spread between them. The recurring paper stock, the matching structural template of the fake service contracts, the same notary names appearing across states and time periods in impossible combinations. Voss is going to argue each case is independent, Reed said. Yes, and Judge Calloway is going to have to decide whether to accept that argument or recognize the pattern. Calloway is a good judge. Whitmore gathered papers with the unhurried precision that seemed to be his baseline mode. He's made the hard call before when the evidence required it. Tomorrow will tell us if it requires it again. The hearing was not public. Calloway kept it in his chambers rather than the courtroom, a decision that reduced it from spectacle to procedure and probably saved everyone considerable drama. Caleb attended with Mahlon. Voss sat across the table from them with his lawyer Ashford, whose face had acquired the slightly depleted quality of a man who'd spent 3 days looking at Whitmore's documentation and finding it harder to answer than he'd expected. Calloway presided with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the weight of a decision was proportional to how carefully you prepared to make it. He examined documents in sequence. He asked specific questions. He permitted Ashford to make arguments and Whitmore to counter them, and he did not show in his face or his manner which arguments he found more persuasive, which was itself a kind of information. When Mahlon testified, and she did, in the careful, precise English she deployed for moments that required her best, she was not afraid. Caleb sat beside her and watched her speak and thought that this was perhaps the thing he'd been watching all along. Not the fear she carried, not the competence she deployed, but the courage underneath both of them, the choice she made every day to stay present and move forward in a world that kept asking her to prove she belonged in it. She described the night her father died, the documents Voss had presented, the night his men arrived. The flight across San Francisco, the train, the long journey to Denver, the decision to place all 4 sisters' futures on the legal protection of 4 marriage certificates in a territory they'd never seen. She described the forged notary stamp with the clinical precision of someone who'd studied it for 2 months. She described all 11 inconsistencies one by one, while Ashford sat across the table and became quieter and quieter, with the specific quality of someone whose argument is losing structural integrity in real time. When she finished, the chamber was very still. Calloway looked at the document with the dead notary stamp for a long moment. Then he set it down, folded his hands, and addressed Voss directly. Mr. Voss, I've examined your documents carefully. I've also examined Agent Whitmore's materials, which include records establishing the death of the named notary 14 months before this instrument's stated date. He paused. I'm going to be direct with you. The documentation you've presented to this court in support of your claim is fraudulent. Not arguably fraudulent, not potentially fraudulent, fraudulent. The instrument purporting to establish the original debt is forged. The service contracts derived from it are therefore void ab initio. There is no valid legal claim here to adjudicate. Ashford said, Your Honor. I'm not finished. Calloway's voice was even unhurried. Furthermore, Agent Whitmore has presented evidence suggesting this is not an isolated fraud, but part of a larger systematic operation. I am directing that copies of all materials from this hearing be forwarded to the Federal District Court in Helena for further proceedings. He looked at Voss. You are not under arrest in this territory, Mr. Voss, because that authority lies with the federal court rather than this one. But I will tell you that I'm recommending immediate action to the district marshal, and I strongly advise you not to test territorial patience by remaining in Coldwater Creek any longer than it takes to arrange your departure. Voss sat very still. His expression had the quality of something being kept in place through considerable effort. This isn't, he started. It is, Calloway said simply. It is concluded in this court. They walked out of the judge's chambers into Montana April sunshine, and Caleb noticed that Mahlon walked differently than she'd walked in. Not taller, she'd always been tall in the essential sense, but somehow lighter, as though something she'd been carrying had been transferred to official custody. Is it over? She asked when they'd walked far enough from the courthouse that the question was private. In this court, yes, the federal case will take longer. He looked at her. But your documents are on their way to Helena. Whitmore says the district case will include Voss's arrest. That's not weeks away, that's days. She stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the street with people moving around her on both sides, and she looked at the sky, blue and wide and indifferent in the specific way of large things that are not indifferent to you but simply vast. And she closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something was different in her face. Not relief exactly, because relief implied that fear had been the primary condition preceding it. What was there was something more like the expression of a person who has been in a fight for a very long time and has just realized that the fighting for the moment is done. I would like, she said carefully, to go home. They rode back to Iron Bend in the particular silence of people who have said everything necessary and are now simply being in the same space together. The ranch appeared ahead. It always appeared, the barns, the fences, the house with its chimneys already producing smoke because someone inside had built up the fires in anticipation of their return. It looked in the April afternoon light like exactly what it was, a home that had been made from hard choices and harder work, and the accumulated weight of people who'd decided to stay. Caleb reined in at the yard gate. Beside him, Malon looked at it for a long moment. You know, she said, I have been thinking about your father's house. What about it? That he built it for generations, to hold more lives than it had yet held, and that it waited. She paused. I think buildings can feel intention. I think this one has been waiting for people who needed it enough to deserve it. That's a generous way to see it. I have been working on being generous with this place. She looked at him. It is easier than I expected. He opened the gate and they rode through, and inside the house, Faye was laughing at something Jesse had done wrong, and Reed and Leanne were having their quiet conversation in the corner, where the light was good, and Fletcher was arguing with Shu Yin about the best way to store tack, and the argument had the particular quality that their arguments always had by now, affectionate, underneath the friction, like two stones that had been rubbing against each other long enough to know each other's shapes. Iron Bend was full. After the long winter of 4 men and their insufficient attempts at permanence, it was finally completely redeemingly full. And that night, when the dinner was done and the fire was low, and the others had drifted to their rooms in ones and twos, Caleb sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee and felt for the first time in 4 years that the future was not something being defended against, but something being moved toward. He didn't know what it would look like. He didn't know which of the things currently building between himself and Malon would eventually be named, or when, or how. He only knew that the fear that had been the ground note of Iron Bend for 4 years had finally changed its character, had become not the fear of losing what you had, but the larger, more generous fear of people who had something worth keeping. It was, he thought, the best possible kind of afraid. Spring arrived at Iron Bend the way it always arrived in Montana, not gently, not with the soft, incremental warming of places that had easier relationships with weather, but in great lurching arguments between the seasons, 3 warm days and 2 days of snow, and then warmth again, more emphatic than before, until the land finally accepted the change and let itself believe. The weeks following the hearing had a quality unlike anything the previous months had held. It was not celebration exactly. Celebration required a completeness. And the federal proceedings in Helena were not complete, and Harlan Voss was not yet in custody, and the shadow of him still fell across the occasional quiet moment in the house, the way winter's memory fell across early spring days. But the primary weight had lifted. The sisters no longer startled at unexpected horses on the road. Malon slept past sunrise twice in a single week, and when Reed noticed and mentioned it, she looked faintly startled, as though the body's return to ordinary rhythms was itself information about how far they'd come. The change showed differently in each of them. Shuyin, freed from the constant, low-level tension of anticipating pursuit, directed her considerable energy fully into the work of the ranch, and the work changed accordingly. She had ideas about the cattle operation that Fletcher received with his characteristic resistance, and then characteristically implemented 3 days later. She had opinions about the fence line on the north pasture that turned out to be correct. She had a memory for the specific habits of individual animals that had been building since their first week at Iron Bend, and had become by April the kind of knowledge that was simply valuable. She's better at this than I am at some of it, Fletcher said to Caleb one afternoon with the particular tone of someone delivering a verdict they'd been resisting for months. Has been for a while, Caleb said. I'm aware. Fletcher looked out at the pasture where Shuyin was working a fence repair. Without assistance, her movements efficient and unsentimental. I was being stubborn. It's your primary mode? It serves me well most of the time. A pause. Just not with her. No, Caleb agreed. I don't think stubbornness serves any of us particularly well with our wives. Fletcher turned to look at him with the expression of a man noticing something for the first time. That's the first time you've called them that. Called them what? Our wives, not the women, not the arrangement, not the sisters. He tilted his head slightly. Our wives. Caleb thought about this. He supposed it was true, somewhere in the weeks of shared work and shared danger, in the accumulating daily evidence of people who decided to be present for each other, the language had quietly changed. The arrangement had become something that didn't require the word arrangement. We should do something about that, Caleb said. Fletcher looked at him. Properly, Caleb clarified. Real ceremonies, not just the paperwork we filed, something that says this is a choice, not a contract. Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. Then Suyin would never admit she wants that. No, but she does. Another pause. Yeah, Fletcher looked back at the fence line. She does. Lynn's paintings had spread across the available wall space of the main room, like a slow tide, each one adding to an accumulating story. There were the memory paintings, the ones that held her history, the mountains and people and gardens of a China she could no longer physically return to. But in April, new paintings appeared alongside them, a specific stand of cottonwood trees along the East Creek rendered in the particular late afternoon light that turned them gold and silver. The north barn in the early mornings, with its weathered boards and the smoke from the heating stove rising in a straight white column. Reed's hands caught in the act of turning a page painted with the attention a person gave to something they decided to keep. Reed had noticed these new paintings and said nothing about them, but his silences around them were different from his ordinary silences, fuller, more inhabited. He brought her better brushes from town without making a particular mention of them. He asked one evening if she would teach him to mix colors, and she had looked at him with the same expression she'd turned on everything since the hearing opened, less defended, available to small pleasures. Why do you want to learn? She asked. Because you make something out of nothing, he said. Blank surface, and then the thing you're seeing exists for other people too. That seems like something worth understanding. She taught him. He was clumsy at it, which he received without the self-consciousness that made clumsiness in front of others painful. And she corrected him with the patient precision of a teacher who had decided her student was worth the time. It became an evening ritual. Leon painting, Reed attempting, both of them speaking less and less as the weeks went on, and the silence between them became the most comfortable kind. Faye and Jesse had become improbably the social engine of a household that had previously run largely without one. They organized the first communal dinner a Sunday evening, to which they invited Tom Aldrich and his wife and the Prices, and Clara and her family, the reading circle women and Sheriff Tuck, who arrived with the expression of a man attending an event he couldn't entirely explain, and found to his surprise entirely pleasant. The dinner was Melon's food served by Faye with the infectious warmth she brought to everything, and it was by any measure that mattered the kind of evening that changed the temperature of a community one room at a time. Afterwards, Sarah Price told Edmund that the Holt family was settled in Coldwater Creek, whether Dorothea Crane liked it or not, and Edmund said he gathered that impression himself, and something was resolved in the town's relationship to Iron Bend that the hearing hadn't fully resolved, and this evening had. It was 3 weeks after the hearing on a Wednesday that had none of the markers of significant days that the second letter arrived from Agent Whitmore. Caleb opened it on the front porch, reading it twice before going inside. He found Melon in the kitchen. She was always in the kitchen when something needed to be done, and things perpetually needed to be done, and handed it to her without speaking. She read it. He watched her face. Harlan Voss had been arrested. The federal warrant had been issued from the district court in Helena, executed in San Francisco, and Voss was in custody pending trial on charges that included forgery, fraudulent debt instruments, conspiracy to compel servitude, and several additional counts that Whitmore's investigation had added from the pattern evidence across 4 territories. Ashford, his lawyer, had been separately charged for knowingly presenting fraudulent documents to a court. The service contracts affecting 14 families, including the 4 Zhao sisters, had been ruled void. The debt instruments were being reviewed by a federal court that was expected to formally invalidate all of them within the week. Melon read the letter to the bottom. Then she set it on the table and stood with her hands flat against the wood, and Caleb waited. 14 families, she said. Yes, we were not the only ones. Her voice had a particular quality, not surprise, because she'd known this intellectually, but the specific weight of confirmed knowledge hitting a person in the chest. You helped bring him down for all of them, Caleb said. Your documentation, the 11 inconsistencies. Whitmore said your evidence was the piece that made the pattern legible. Malon stood very still for another moment. Then she straightened slowly and turned to face him, and what was on her face was something Caleb had never quite seen there before. Not the composed competence, not the managed fear, not the careful calculation. Something simpler. Something that looked like the expression of a person who has finally arrived at the place they've been traveling toward. Call everyone, she said. I want everyone to hear it together. They gathered in the main room, all 8 of them, on a Wednesday afternoon, with April light coming through the windows and the sounds of the ranch operating around them, the ordinary sounds of a life that had been built one difficult day at a time and was now simply wonderfully theirs to keep. Caleb read the letter aloud. The response was not one thing. It was 8 people having 8 different versions of the same relief. Faye cried openly and immediately without the self-consciousness that had sometimes qualified her emotions, and Jesse held her with the completeness of someone who decided that this was his person, and her feelings were therefore something he would always make room for. Shuyin sat very still for a long moment, jaw set, and then said to no one in particular, "Good," in a voice that contained entire volumes. Lion reached over and took Reed's hand without looking at him, and he turned his hand over and held hers with the specific, careful grip of someone who understood what they were holding. Fletcher cleared his throat twice. "Well," he said finally, "that's settled then." "That's settled?" Shuyin agreed, looking at him. They looked at each other across the room with the particular directness that had been building between them since their first argument about fence line methodology, and had arrived by this point at something that didn't require mediation or subtext or the ongoing performance of mutual indifference they'd been maintaining for appearances. "I want to ask you something," Fletcher said. "Ask. Properly. Not here." He looked at his brothers with the expression of someone who suddenly found the room too inhabited. "Later." Shuyin considered this for exactly 1 second. "Yes," she said before the question was asked. Fletcher looked at her. "I haven't. You are going to ask me if I will marry you again properly with everyone watching and everything official." "The answer is yes." She paused. "You're welcome." Fletcher turned to his brothers for support and found none of it available. That evening, the conversation turned to what came next. Real weddings, not the legal filings, not the papers in the county clerk's office that had served their essential protective function, but actual celebrations that would say in front of everyone who mattered that these marriages were choices made freely by people who meant them. "We should do it in May," Jesse said, "when the wildflowers are out, when the whole ranch looks like it's trying." "That's in 3 weeks, Malon said. "Yes." He looked at Faye. "Is that enough time?" Faye smiled with the particular radiance of someone given a project they're perfectly equipped to execute. "I will need a list," she said, "and unrestricted access to Edmund Price's stockroom and permission to write 12 letters to people in town." "Done," Caleb said. "Then yes, 3 weeks is exactly enough time." What followed was in many ways the happiest 3 weeks Iron Bend had seen. Not because hardship was absent, the ranch still required all the ordinary work of ranches, and the weather still exercised its opinions with frontier frequency, but because it was occupied by people who were building something they were certain they wanted to keep. And certainty, even in the middle of labor, had a particular quality that transformed the labor. Faye and Jesse coordinated the event with the combined energy of optimism unleashed. Faye wrote letters to the Reading Circle women and received enthusiastic responses. She negotiated with Edmund Price for flowers, late tulips, and early wildflowers, and whatever ribbon he had in stock, with the cheerful relentlessness of someone who discovered that relentlessness was not a flaw, but a tool. Jesse built the arch that they agreed should stand at the center of the ceremony, working with Reed in the barn evenings, while Lion painted decorations for it that combined prairie wildflowers with traditional Chinese motifs in patterns that were neither one thing nor the other, but entirely their own. Malon cooked. She cooked in a way that made cooking look like a different category of activity than what it usually was. She cooked the way she did everything that mattered, with the focused completeness of someone investing herself fully in the outcome. She and Caleb spent an evening at the kitchen table planning the menu, which became, like many of their kitchen evenings, something longer and more personal than its ostensible purpose. "You never told me what your mother was like," he said at some point when the menu had been decided and neither of them had moved to go to bed. She was very quiet, Malon said. Quieter than me. She communicated through her hands mostly what she cooked, what she made, how she arranged things. You could always tell what she was feeling by what appeared on the table. What would she have put on the table today? Malon thought about this. Dumplings, she said finally, with a very specific kind of filling she made when she was happy. Pork and ginger and a little sugar, which is wrong by most standards, but was somehow exactly right. She paused. I haven't made them in 3 years. I was afraid of what it would feel like. To feel her in the food, to feel her absence in it. She looked at her hands. She died before the trouble with Voss, before any of this. She didn't know what happened to us after. What do you think she would have made of all this? He gestured slightly. The kitchen, the house, the ranch, the whole improbable structure they'd been building. Malon was quiet for a long moment, and in the lamplight, her expression was soft with something private and bittersweet. She would have told me I held on too tight, she said finally. She always said I gripped everything too hard as though it would fly away. She would have told me to open my hands. She paused, and then she would have made the dumplings. Caleb looked at her across the table and felt something that had been building in him for weeks, quietly, reliably, with the patience of something that had decided it was going to be true, regardless of whether it was acknowledged, rise to the surface of him, and become unavoidable. I'd like to hear about her, he said. If you want to tell me, not tonight necessarily, but over time, I'd like to know who she was. Malon looked at him steadily with the specific expression of someone taking the measure of a thing being offered and finding it genuine. Over time, she said, yes, I think I'd like that. She made the dumplings the following Sunday on a rainy afternoon with the whole household present, and she moved through the making of them with her eyes slightly too bright and her movements very careful. And when Faye tasted the first one, she said in Cantonese, "That's Mama." And Malon turned to the window and stood there for a moment, and no one spoke, and no one needed to. Later, Caleb found her in the garden, standing in the rain with her face turned up to it. You'll get cold, he said. I know. She didn't move. She used to stand in the rain like this, said it was the one time the world was washing everything clean. She lowered her head and looked at him. Her face was wet, and her eyes were clear, and she was in that moment the least armored he had ever seen her. I am beginning to let myself want this, she said. What we're building, not because I need it for safety, because I want it for myself. He stepped into the rain beside her. Good, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she stepped forward and took his hand with both of hers, deliberate, unhurried, and held it the way people held things they intended to keep. And they stood together in the rain while it washed the last of the long winter away, and the dumplings were warm inside, and the wildflowers in the meadow were 2 weeks from blooming, and Iron Bend was home. The decision about real weddings prompted inevitably the question of what real weddings in their particular context should look like. This was not a simple question. There were 4 couples with 8 different histories, 8 different relationships to ceremony and tradition, and a surrounding community that was still in the process of deciding what it thought about all of them. The conversation happened over several evenings, each couple finding their own version of what they wanted to say about what they'd become. Fletcher's proposal to Shu Yin, when it finally happened privately on the North Pasture fence line, that had been the site of their first serious disagreement, was by all reports short. I want to do this properly, he'd said, which was not technically a question, but which she had answered anyway with the kind of directness she brought to everything, and they'd returned to the house looking unchanged in every external way and were somehow entirely different. What was gone was the thin maintenance of mutual indifference that had been their social camouflage for months. What replaced it was not demonstrative. Fletcher and Shu Yin were not demonstrative people, but it was visible in the way they occupied space near each other, in the specific way he turned when she spoke, in the way she didn't hide the fact that she was watching him. Reed and Leon's version was quieter still. He asked her while she was painting, sitting beside her in the corner chair that had become specifically his corner chair, and she set down her brush and looked at her painting for a moment before she looked at him, and what she said was, I would like to paint this place for a very long time, which meant yes, which meant something more than yes, which he understood completely. Jesse's proposal to Faye was predictably the most eventful. He'd planned to ask at dinner in front of everyone, but lost his nerve twice, and then executed it at an entirely inopportune moment halfway through fixing a broken stall door, which meant he was holding a hammer. There was straw in his hair, and the setting was a barn that smelled strongly of horses. Faye said yes before he'd finished the sentence and immediately began laughing. And the laughter was the kind that came from perfect joy at perfect imperfection. And Jesse stood in his straw-covered haystack of a proposal moment and laughed with her. And it was everyone agreed afterward exactly right. Caleb's was last, and the last to be settled on, because Caleb had been taking longer than the others to arrive at a settled understanding of what he felt and what he intended to do with it. He had not, in the 4 years since his parents died, permitted himself to want anything much beyond the continuity of the ranch and the welfare of his brothers. Wanting things required a kind of openness that loss had made dangerous. It required believing that the future was a place worth investing in, that the things you built wouldn't be taken by the random and different forces that had taken his parents on a Tuesday morning with no warning and no explanation. Closing that want down had been a practical decision, the kind that kept you functional when function was the only thing you could afford. Meilon had been dismantling it since the night of the blizzard. Not forcibly, she'd had the intelligence, and he thought the instinct not to push at a thing that needed to be moved gently. But she'd been present, consistent. She'd offered her true self to him in increments. The competence first, then the fear, then the history, then the grief for her mother, and now the want, the real want, the thing under all the survival. That was just a woman who wanted to be known and valued and stayed with. It was the wanting that broke through whatever was left of his reserve. He asked her on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen because the kitchen was theirs in the particular way that certain spaces in a house became the spaces where the most important things happened. He didn't kneel. He was sitting across from her at the table where they'd spent dozens of evenings over the previous months, and he said what he'd been preparing to say for the better part of 3 weeks. "You came here because you needed safety," he said, "and I agreed to this because I needed help building something. And both of those things were true, and both of them are still true, but they're not the main thing anymore." He looked at her. "The main thing is that I want to be your husband because you're exactly who you are. Not because you're useful or capable or brave, though you are all of those things. But because when you stand in the rain thinking about your mother, that's a person I want to know for the rest of my life." Meilon sat across from him and looked at him with an expression he'd never quite seen before, wholly open, stripped of the careful architecture she maintained against the world, a face he'd now seen in the rain, but hadn't expected to see here at the kitchen table in the ordinary lamplight. "Yes," she said, quietly, certainly, with all the weight of a woman who'd crossed an ocean and survived a winter and a predator, and 4 years of fear, to arrive at this table where someone finally asked her what she wanted for herself rather than what she could provide for others. Yes, the wedding itself was held on the 14th of May, which was the first day that could genuinely be called warm. Iron Ben's meadow was doing exactly what Jesse had predicted, trying very hard wildflowers and new grass, and the particular luminous green of Montana spring competing for attention and succeeding at it. The sky was the kind of blue that seemed too pure to be weather, too composed to be accidental. People came from miles around. The Aldrich family and the Colquitts and half a dozen other ranch families who'd watched the slow integration of 8 newcomers into their county landscape with varying degrees of approval and had resolved over the course of the winter into something closer to acceptance. The reading circle, women almost unanimously with Sarah Price among them wearing the expression of someone who'd made up her mind about an injustice and intended to be visible in her opposition to it. Clara and her family, Clara looking at Faye across the yard with the specific warmth of someone who'd found a friend in unexpected territory. Sheriff Tuck, who had removed his badge for the occasion as a personal gesture that most people noticed and no one commented on. Agent Whitmore, who had returned to Coldwater Creek for reasons he described as procedural and which everyone understood were personal. Edmund Price was there. And so Caleb noticed with the quiet attention he gave to such things was Dorothea Crane standing toward the back, not demonstratively present, but present nonetheless, wearing the expression of a woman in the process of revising an opinion she'd held too long. Judge Calloway officiated. He'd written new words for the occasion, dispensing with the standard ceremony language in favor of something that acknowledged the specific truth of what these marriages were not: traditional arrangements, not conventional alliances, but 4 deliberate choices made between people who'd had every reason not to trust and had decided to anyway. When he asked for objections, the silence was total. Whatever Dorothea Crane was revising, it was complete enough that she said nothing. Whatever the community had decided about the Holt family and their Chinese wives, the decision was there in the silence. Not unanimous, probably never entirely unanimous, but sufficient to stand in. The four couples stood under Jesse's arch with lions' painted flowers twining through the pine branches, prairie roses and red silk blossoms, and Chinese characters that Fei had painted herself, meaning luck and beginning and home. Each couple had written their own vows. Fletcher and Shuyin were characteristically direct. They promised to challenge each other, to build something together that neither could build alone, and to not pretend to be simpler than they were for each other's comfort. Shuyin added in Chinese, and then in English, that she promised to be wrong in front of him, which she said was the hardest thing she could promise, and therefore the most important. Fletcher said with the gruffness of a man saying something vulnerable in public and refusing to apologize for the vulnerability that he promised to listen before arguing most of the time. Reed and Lian were quieter. He promised to pay attention, which she had told him was the greatest gift one person could give another. She promised to paint him as he actually was, not as he wished to be seen, which was everyone present understood a far more serious promise than it sounded. When she spoke her vows, her voice was steady and her hands were still, and she looked at Reed with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who had decided where she belonged and was no longer afraid of the decision. Jesse and Fei were everything anyone could have predicted. Jesse stumbling over his written words and then abandoning them entirely to say something extemporaneous and entirely true. Fei crying through her vows and still managing to make everyone laugh at the right moment with the instinct of someone who understood that joy and tenderness were not different things. When Calloway pronounced them married, Fei pulled Jesse down to her height and kissed him before the judge had finished the sentence, and the laughter that moved through the assembled crowd was warm and genuine, and the kind that happened at events people would talk about for years. And Caleb and Meilon. She wore a dress that was neither fully Chinese nor fully American, but thoroughly hers, a deep blue silk bodice over a prairie-cut skirt, her hair arranged with both traditional pins and a small cascade of wildflowers that Fei had woven in that morning. She had walked toward him through the assembled guests with the straightness that was fundamental to how she moved through the world, and Caleb had stood at the arch watching her come and had felt every week of the previous 5 months compressed into the distance between them, all the work and fear and daily accumulated evidence of two people discovering they were better for each other's presence. She reached him. They stood facing each other. He said his vows. He had written them over a period of 10 days, revising each time he thought he was done, because each revision removed another layer of indirection until what was left was simply the truth that she had shown him. That closing yourself to wanting things was not caution, but waste, that she had built a home from what she found here, the way she built everything with care and intelligence, and an insistence on doing it right, and that the home she'd built included him, and he intended to be worthy of that. She said hers. Her voice was steady and her English was precise, and she said that she had arrived here with 4 documents and no certainty, and had found something she had not dared to look for a man who saw her as a person and not a problem to solve, who held space for her history without letting it define her future, who stood in the rain when she needed someone to stand with. She said that she chose him every day, not because she must, but because she had looked at the full picture of who he was and found it more than enough. Calloway said the words. The crowd around them was quiet in the way that crowds were quiet when something real was happening. Somewhere in the middle distance, a bird was doing something ambitious and musical. "You may kiss your bride," Calloway said. And Caleb kissed her there in the Montana May sunshine with wildflowers and silk ribbon and the accumulated witnesses of a community that was still in process but was present, and she kissed him back with the completeness of someone who had finally fully arrived at the place she'd been traveling toward. When they broke apart, the sound that came from the assembled guests was not polite applause. It was something louder and more personal, the sound of people who'd watched a winter unfold and were pleased with how the spring had arrived. Vi was the first to reach them, which surprised no one. Finally, she said with the absolute conviction of someone who'd been waiting for this specific moment for months and intended the celebration to begin immediately. "We were married in November," Caleb pointed out. "You know what I mean," Fei said, already turning to direct the music that someone had started at the edge of the yard. He did know what she meant. He looked at Meilon beside him, and she was watching her youngest sister with an expression that held everything, the love and the grief and the long cold journey and the wildflowers, in the spring and the fact that they had all made it here together intact into the life they decided to claim. She's not wrong, Mahlon said. No, Caleb agreed. She rarely is. The celebration that followed lasted until the stars came out, and past them, the kind of event that a community remembered as a turning point, not because of what was declared, but because of what was felt, the unmistakable sense of things settling into their proper arrangement after a long, uncertain time. Late in the evening, when the music had softened and guests had scattered in small groups across the yard, and the fires had burned to useful coals, Caleb found himself at the edge of the meadow looking back at Iron Bend, the way he sometimes looked at it when he needed to remember what it was for. The house held lamplight in every window, voices carried across the cooling air, laughter from the direction of Jesse and Faye's corner of the yard, the low, steady tone of Reed in conversation with someone, the particular quality of silence from the north fence, where Fletcher and Shu Yin had disappeared an hour ago and had not yet returned. Mahlon came to stand beside him. She was still wearing the wildflowers in her hair. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "My father," he said. "He built this place to outlast him. And it has. But I don't think he imagined it would outlast him like this." He looked at the house. He pictured more of the same, probably. More men like us wives who looked the way wives looked in the towns he'd come from. Would he have been unhappy with how it turned out? Caleb thought about his father honestly, the man, rather than the memory. The complicated, difficult, stubborn, practical human being who'd built 800 acres from nothing and loved his sons in the unsentimental way of men who express love through provision and presence rather than declaration. No, he said, he was a man who valued work and kept promises. He would have recognized both. He looked at her. "I think he'd have been afraid of you, actually. You're better at most things than he was." Mahlon's smile was quiet and private and entirely genuine. "I am not better at cattle." "No, but everything else." She leaned slightly against his arm, and he felt it, the deliberate choice of proximity, the small trust of leaning, and he thought that this was what the future looked like, not a grand declaration, but the accumulation of choices to be close to each other daily, ordinary, irreplaceable. "I was thinking," she said, "about what my mother told me once about belonging somewhere. She said you don't belong to a place. You belong with the people in it." She looked at the house, the lights, the shadows of people moving behind the windows. "I understand that now." He did not say anything because nothing needed to be added to it. Above them, the Montana stars were doing their usual extravagant work, indifferent and ancient, and somehow on this particular evening, but unkind. Anaya. The summer that followed the wedding was the best summer Iron Bend had seen in years, and everyone who lived there knew it with the particular awareness of people who understood that good seasons were not given, but built. June arrived with the long northern light that stretched evenings past 9 o'clock and made the meadows luminous and strange in that particular way of Montana at latitude, the sky holding color long after sunset like a person unwilling to let go of a good day. The cattle were healthy. The garden that Mahlon had planted in April was producing already spring onions and early lettuce, and the first ambitious shoots of the potato rows she'd laid out with the precision of someone making a long-term investment. The wildflowers in the eastern meadow were at their peak, and Lion painted them every morning from the porch, adding to the collection that had transformed the main room from functional to inhabited. The federal proceedings in Helena had moved with a deliberate pace of law, which is to say slowly but with mounting weight. Adjutant Whitmore sent letters at intervals, methodical, clear, containing information rather than reassurance, and each letter advanced the picture of what was being built in the courtroom several hundred miles north. The case against Harlan Voss had expanded as Whitmore's investigation accumulated 16 families across 4 territories, 31 fraudulent documents, a scheme that had been operating for, at minimum, 4 years before Mahlon's annotated evidence gave federal prosecutors the structural framework they'd needed to make the pattern legible. The letter that arrived in mid-June contained a single sentence that Mahlon read 3 times before setting it down. Harlan Voss had entered a guilty plea. He had not done so from conscience. He had done so because his lawyers had looked at the assembled evidence, the dead notary, the 11 inconsistencies multiplied across 16 cases, the testimony of 14 families who were now represented by a federal prosecutor rather than navigating the legal system alone, and had advised their client that the mathematics of the trial were not in his favor. A plea meant reduced charges. A plea meant some control over the outcome. A plea meant acknowledging the scheme was real and accepting consequences calibrated to that acknowledgement rather than consequences calibrated to a jury's reaction to the full picture. The consequences were substantial. Voss would serve time in a federal facility. Ashford, his lawyer, had negotiated separately and received a lesser sentence in exchange for detailed testimony about the operation's structure. The fraudulent instruments affecting all 16 families were formally voided. The debt claims were extinguished. The service contracts were recognized under law as what they had always been, instruments of coercion with no legal standing whatsoever. In the third week of June, Judge Calloway received official documentation confirming that the Chen family debt instruments were permanently invalidated by federal court order and that all four Zhao sisters were recognized under territorial and federal law as free persons without outstanding obligations of any kind to any California creditor. Calloway sent the papers to Iron Ben with a note in his own hand that read, "Well concluded. The law worked as intended for once." Meilon held the papers for a long time. She sat at the kitchen table with Caleb across from her and her sisters arranged around her in the constellation they'd held since childhood. And she read the language of the court order line by line with the specific attention of someone verifying something they'd been afraid to entirely believe. When she reached the end, she set it down. The silence lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then Faye said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "It's really done." "It's really done," Meilon confirmed. What happened after was not dramatic. There was no explosion of relief, no collapse of the careful composure that had held the four of them upright through a year of sustained uncertainty. What happened was something quieter and more complete, the particular release that comes when a weight is removed that has been present long enough to become part of how you hold yourself. You don't know until it's gone how much of your posture had been organized around carrying it. Shuyin got up and walked out to the yard and stood in the June sunlight for a long time alone, and Fletcher watched her from the barn door and did not go to her because he understood perhaps better than anyone that some relief required space rather than company. He waited until she turned and looked at him across the yard with an expression he'd never seen from her before, something wide open and uncalculated. And then he walked to her, and she let him, and what passed between them in the yard on a Tuesday morning in June was private and quiet and real. Lan painted that day. She painted for 6 hours without stopping, and what emerged was not the carefully controlled images of memory and preservation that had characterized her earlier work. What emerged was something looser, more present, the specific quality of light on the kitchen table where the court papers still lay. Reed's coffee cup, the window above the sink and the garden visible through it, and the mountains above the garden and the sky above the mountains. It was a painting about here and now rather than there and then, and when she showed it to Reed that evening, he looked at it for a long time without speaking. "You're painting what you have," he said finally. "I'm painting what I want to keep," she corrected gently. "It turns out they're the same thing now." Caleb found Meilon in the garden an hour after the household had quieted, kneeling between the potato rows with her hands in the soil for no particular reason he could identify. Not weeding, not harvesting, just her hands in the earth. "You've been out here a while," he said. "I like how this feels." She looked at her hands, the dark soil against her palms. In San Francisco, everything was hard surfaces. Stone brick glass. I never had my hands in actual ground. She looked up at him. "I understand now why your father wanted land. There's something in it, something that says you're real, that what you're doing is real." He crouched beside her. "What are you feeling?" She considered the question with the seriousness she gave to questions worth answering. "Light," she said finally. "The way you feel light after you've been carrying something heavy for a long time. My arms want to go up." She looked slightly embarrassed by the image. "That's a strange thing to say." "It's not strange." He reached over and brushed soil from the back of her hand. "You've been carrying it for 3 years. You're allowed to feel it leave." She turned her hand over and took his. They sat in the garden row for a while, not saying anything, not needing to. Around them, the June light did its extravagant evening work, and the beans were coming in along the south wall, and somewhere in the barn, a horse was expressing an opinion about dinner with the conviction of an animal that had no reason to be subtle about its needs. Iron Bend in summer was a different place than Iron Bend in winter. Not better exactly. The winters had their own austere beauty, and the months of storm and close quarters and daily managed crisis had built things between all 8 of them that easier seasons might not have, but more generous, more legible. The land showed its intentions in summer, the grass and the water, and the particular quality of the light that fell across the valley in long golden sheets in the evenings, and the intentions were good. They had learned their rhythms. Fletcher and Shuyin managed the cattle operation with the efficiency of two people who had converted competition into collaboration and found the result better than either of them alone. Fletcher had developed over 6 months the specific skill of presenting his opinions to Shuyin as questions, not because he'd become less certain, but because he'd found that involving her in the reasoning produced better outcomes than presenting her with conclusions. She had developed the specific skill of not saying "I told you so" when her ideas proved correct, which she described to Meilon as her greatest personal achievement of the year. Reed and Leon had built a life of quiet depth that the household around them occasionally glimpsed and then respectfully looked away from, not because it was private in a guarded sense, but because it was clearly entire, a world complete in itself that didn't require audience. They read together every evening. They argued occasionally about philosophy and art and the nature of beauty, with the specific pleasure of two people who discovered they could disagree profoundly and enjoy each other more for it. Reed had learned to mix colors with reasonable competence and had produced one Saturday afternoon a small painting of the north fence line in winter that Lion kept on the shelf above her paints, without comment, which was itself a considerable comment. Jesse and Faye had become in the fullest sense each other's person. It was visible in the ease of them, the way they occupied space together, as though they had been designed for adjacency, the way Faye's natural warmth was amplified in Jesse's company, and Jesse's natural optimism was grounded in Faye's. They talked about children quietly in the evenings. They talked about the reading circle and whether Faye might start teaching English to the 3 Chinese families who'd settled near Billings and had written to Meilon asking if there was a community forming. They talked about everything continuously with the appetite of two people who had found in each other an inexhaustible interest. The English teaching idea caught fire. By August, Faye had written a dozen letters and received responses from 7 families. By September, she was riding into Coldwater Creek twice a week with a saddlebag full of books and teaching 3 children and 2 adults the particular pleasure and difficulty of English from a woman who remembered exactly what it felt like to learn it herself. Caleb watched all of it and felt satisfaction was perhaps the closest word, though satisfaction was insufficient. He had spent 4 years holding Iron Bend together through sheer will and a refusal to let himself imagine it differently, and now he was watching it become something he hadn't imagined because he hadn't allowed himself to a place where people thrived rather than endured, where the daily work was done by people who found meaning in it, where the future was not a threat to be managed, but a territory worth moving toward. He and Meilon had settled into the particular ease of people who'd done the hard work of becoming known to each other. They disagreed productively. She thought he was too conservative in his planning. He thought she occasionally overestimated what could be accomplished in a single season, and both of them were occasionally right. She had taken over the household and ranch economics entirely, and the result was that for the first time in 4 years, the operation was not merely surviving, but generating enough surplus to begin addressing the accumulated deferred maintenance that his father's death had left behind. A new roof on the north barn, proper fencing around the kitchen garden, a second heating stove for the main room's far end that made the deep winter evenings considerably less about endurance. She told him about her mother in installments, the way she'd offered him everything else gradually over evenings at the kitchen table, each piece of the story offered when she'd decided she trusted the moment with it. He told her about his father in the same way, not the history or the accomplishments, but the person, the stubbornness, and the humor, and the way he'd cried at the birth of each of his sons and refused to acknowledge having done so, and the particular quality of his silences which had communicated more than most people's words. "I think they would have understood each other," Meilon said one evening, in the middle of a story about her mother's relationship with the neighbor's vegetable garden. "They were both stubborn people who loved things they couldn't entirely protect," Caleb said. "Yes." She was quieter for a moment. "That's a good description of most people, actually. Including us. Including us." She looked at him with the expression that was by now among his most important possessions, the open one, the unguarded one, the one she gave him when she decided to stop managing her face and simply be present. "Though we are getting better at protecting things." "We are," he agreed. In September, a letter arrived from San Francisco that was not from Voss and was not legal. It was from one of the other 14 families, a woman named Pearl Lee, who had been one of Voss's victims and had found Iron Ben's address through Whitmore's office. The letter was brief. It said that she had heard about the Zhao sisters and their part in bringing the scheme down, and that she wanted to say thank you, and that she hoped they were well and that she was rebuilding. Meilon wrote back immediately a letter that took her 3 evenings to compose, and which was when she read it aloud to her sisters, not just a response to Pearl Lee, but a document of everything they'd built: the ranch, the marriages, the community, the slow transformation of flight into arrival. She described Iron Bend in the specific detail of someone painting it in words, and she ended by inviting Pearl Lee to visit if she ever found herself needing a place to land. Pearl Lee came the following spring for 2 weeks with her daughter. She sat at Meilon's kitchen table and ate the dumplings and met the brothers and the sisters in the community of Coldwater Creek that had gradually and incompletely and nonetheless genuinely incorporated 4 Chinese women and their improbable frontier marriages. And she said on her last evening that she hadn't believed places like this existed for people like them. They exist because people make them, Meilon said. That's the only way they exist. The months between the wedding and the second winter were full in the way that good seasons fill, not with drama or crisis, but with the steady accumulation of ordinary life made extraordinary by the people living it. July brought the first real harvest from Meilon's garden. The potatoes came in better than she'd projected. The beans exceeded her estimates, and the tomatoes, which everyone, including Caleb, had privately doubted, would manage the altitude and the short growing season, produced with such abundance that she was putting them up in jars 3 days a week through the height of August and still had surplus to send with Faye to the reading circle. Edmund Price, examining the jars she brought to trade against the account she'd been building since March, set one down and said with the candor of a merchant confronting a useful fact, "You know what you're doing." "Yes," Meilon said pleasantly, "I do." The trade arrangement had grown considerably more favorable over the summer months, adjusted 3 times as the reality of what Iron Ben's garden could produce became clear. Price was not a man of particular warmth, but he was a man of commercial honesty, and commercial honesty required him to acknowledge when someone was providing him genuine value. He had begun without apparent ceremony referring to Meilon to other merchants as someone worth doing business with. This had consequences that radiated outward in the specific way that reputation radiated in small frontier communities, slowly and then all at once until it was simply part of what people knew. The Thursday reading circle had evolved under Faye's irrepressible participation from a polite social occasion into something that occasionally resembled an actual community institution. Faye had a gift for finding the thing in a room that was pretending not to be interesting and making it interesting by asking the questions no one else thought to ask. She had turned a discussion of a novel about an orphaned heroine into a 2-hour conversation about what it meant to build a family from choice rather than circumstance. And 3 women present had cried for reasons they didn't entirely explain. And Clara had told Faye afterward that it was the most honest conversation she'd had in Coldwater Creek. Dorothea Crane had not attended that meeting, but she had heard about it from 3 separate sources, and the precision with which she subsequently declined to comment when the subject arose in her presence was itself a kind of comment. August produced the kind of heat that made even Montana's scale feel intimate. The air thick and still between thunderstorms that moved through the valley with the abrupt authority of something that did not check schedules. The brothers and sisters worked through it with the focused pragmatism of people who understood that weather was not an opinion, but a condition, and conditions were to be managed rather than resented. It was in the heat of a late August afternoon, working alongside Fletcher and Shu Yin on repairs to the south barn roof, that Caleb understood something he had been circling without landing on for weeks. He was watching his brother. Fletcher and Shu Yin worked together on the roof with the coordinated efficiency of 2 people who'd been doing the same work together long enough to develop a shared physical language, each anticipating the other's movements, each filling the gap before the other knew the gap existed. They were arguing about something, as they always were, the specific tone that their arguments had developed, which was nothing like the friction of incompatibility and entirely like the friction of 2 people who found the resistance of the other's mind genuinely engaging. And between the argument sentences, between the specific claims and counterclaims, there were glances. Quick, involuntary, the kind you didn't notice yourself making. Caleb had seen that look before. He'd seen it in the mirror of his father's eyes when his mother crossed the room. He'd been too young to name it then. He could name it now. Fletcher Holt had fallen in love with his wife. He appeared to be roughly the last person in the household to know. Caleb descended from the ladder, found a bucket of water, and said nothing. because there were things a brother did not need to point out and things that earned genuine appreciation, and knowing the difference was one of the core skills of the oldest sibling. By September, what had happened between Fletcher and Shu Yin was visible in the particular way that certain changes became visible not through declaration but through the gradual disappearance of its opposite. The competitive guardedness that had characterized them since November was simply gone, replaced by the ease of people who had stopped protecting themselves from something they decided to trust. They still argued. They would always argue. It was woven into the fundamental texture of how they encountered each other, and neither of them would have it different. But the arguments had a different quality now, generous rather than defensive, built from curiosity rather than the need to establish that you could hold your ground. Shuyan told Mei-lan about it in the kitchen one evening with the directness she brought to everything that mattered. "I didn't expect to love him," she said. "I expected to respect him." That was enough, I thought. A pause. It turned out not to be the ceiling. "What changed?" Mei-lan asked. "He admitted he was wrong, about me specifically, about whether I could do this work." Shuyan looked at her hands. Not once, many times, small things each time. But a man who can be wrong in front of you and not be diminished by it, that is a man you can trust with things that matter. Mei-lan thought about this afterward, long past the end of the kitchen conversation, and recognized in it something that applied not only to Shu Yin and Fletcher. She thought about the ways Caleb had been wrong in front of her, had admitted to misreading situations, to misjudging what she needed, to holding assumptions that the evidence had required him to revise. He did it without apology, exactly, and without self-flagellation, in the straightforward manner of someone who treated being corrected as information rather than defeat. She had trusted him with her history. She had trusted him with her fear. She had trusted him with her mother's recipes, which was not a small thing. She had not yet told him she loved him, because she was in some part of herself. She was actively working to expand, still cautious about saying the largest things. Not from doubt, she had no doubt, but from the habit of protection that had been so necessary for so long that it didn't entirely know it was no longer needed. She decided that night that the habit had been indulged long enough. She told him the following morning, in the specific and ordinary context of the kitchen, before the household was awake while he was building the fire, and she was beginning the bread that would feed everyone through the day. She said it the way she said most important things, without preamble, precisely as though it were a fact she was adding to a conversation already in progress. "I love you," she said. "I have been meaning to say it for some time." He turned from the fire and looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained several things at once: surprise because she hadn't prepared him, and something that was not surprise at all. "I know," he said. "I've been waiting." She looked at him. "You knew. You make dumplings when you're happy," he said. "You've been making them for months." She looked at the counter where the dough was currently sitting, and then she looked at him, and then she started laughing, the real laugh, the one that came from somewhere she didn't guard, the one that sounded like something entirely her own. "I love you too," he said, while she was still laughing with the simplicity of someone for whom the statement had been prepared and waiting and needed only the right moment to be released. "I've been meaning to say that for some time as well." She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him and looked up at him with the expression that was specifically his, the open one, the unguarded one, the one that nobody else received because it had been reserved without her entirely deciding to reserve it for the person who'd earned it. He put his arms around her and held her with the completeness of someone who had been holding things together for 4 years and had finally quietly decided that holding this one person close was the work he'd been building towards all along. "It took us long enough," she said against his shoulder. "We're not impulsive people," he agreed. She laughed again, quieter this time, and stayed where she was. And outside, the Montana morning was doing its slow, cold work of becoming day, and inside the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and bread dough. And somewhere upstairs, Faye was beginning to sing, as she always sang in the mornings, a song that moved between Chinese and English, the way all of them had learned to move back and forth easily, carrying both with them wherever they went. The autumn moved through its inventory of tasks with the purposeful quality of seasons that understood their own brevity. The second harvest was larger than the first. The cattle were in good shape going into winter. Reed's account showed Iron Ben was not merely solvent, but had built for the first time since their parents died, something that deserved the word surplus. It was in October that Lyon told Reed very quietly, and with the specific precision of a person ensuring they were understood, that she was expecting. He sat down. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and that she subsequently painted from memory and kept on the wall above their bed the expression of a man understanding that the future had become irrevocably, joyfully real. When was the first thing he managed? Spring, she said, when the wildflowers are out. He reached over and took both her hands and held them, and said nothing for a while because he was Reed, and Reed's most important communications didn't use words. The news moved through the household with the velocity and warmth of very good news in a family that had been built from chosen love rather than given circumstance, which is to say it moved fast and it landed deep. Faye immediately began planning things that didn't need to be planned yet. Jesse started woodworking projects that weren't yet specified. Shu Yin, who responded to big feelings with action rather than expression, repainted the room at the end of the hall that had been used for storage and said nothing about why she'd done it and didn't need to. Meilon cooked. She cooked the specific things that her mother had made during the 2 pregnancies. She remembered soups she hadn't made since San Francisco, root vegetables prepared in ways that her mother had said kept strength in the body through long seasons. She did not tell Lian this was the reason, and Lian, who understood her oldest sister, completely did not ask. The second winter arrived in November, earlier than the first and more certain of its intentions. The snow came down from the Bitterroot with the authority of something that had been building for months and intended to be taken seriously. The hay was in, the cattle were settled, the house was prepared with the particular thoroughness of 8 people who had been through one Montana winter already and had opinions about how to face the second. On the first night of real snowfall, when the world outside had become the same white curtain that had greeted them on their arrival almost exactly a year before, Caleb stood at the main room window and watched the snow fall on Iron Bend and felt the year move through him like a river. The blizzard arrival and the impossible negotiation in the cold, the weeks of learning each other, the threat from San Francisco, and the long preparation, the hearing and the wedding in the summer, and the letter from Pearl Lee, and the morning in the kitchen when Meilon had told him she loved him, and Leanne's news, and Faye's singing, and the dumplings, and the paintings, and the ordinary days between the events that were in many ways the most important thing of all. Meilon came to stand beside him. Same view as last year, she said. Different everything else. She leaned against his arm. Outside, the snow fell the way it always fell in Montana, with total commitment, indifferent to what it covered, making everything unfamiliar and clean. My mother used to say that a place becomes yours when you've spent a winter in it, she said. That winter was the test, that it showed you what things were made of. What did this winter show you? She was quiet for a moment, looking at the snow. That I was made for this, she said finally. Not for Montana specifically, or the ranch, or even the marriages, but for the work of building something with people I've chosen. That's what I'm made for. She looked at him. I didn't know that about myself until now. Caleb looked out at the snow falling on the land his father had built, and the land he had held, and the land they were all making something of together. And he thought that this specific moment, this woman, this house full of the people they'd become to each other, was the thing his father had been building toward without knowing it. Not the land, not the legacy in the legal sense, but the proof that the things you build with your hands matter less than what you're willing to build with your life. I know, he said simply. I can see it. She turned and looked at him with the expression that was his alone, and in the warm light of the room behind them, in the cold white world beyond the window, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything the frontier had ever promised finally kept. By the time the second winter came to Iron Bend, the house had been transformed in ways that made the original structure almost unrecognizable in spirit, if not in frame. Leanne's paintings covered entire walls now, a gallery of Montana and memory of present and past of the 8 people who had arrived here from such different directions and made something together that none of them could have made alone. The kitchen smelled permanently of something good. The sounds of voices in multiple languages layered over the creak of cold settling timber and the wind in the chimney and the distant sounds of a working ranch, and those sounds together were the sound of Iron Bend, as it had become not 4 men enduring a space too large for them, but a home built to the scale of the lives inside it. On the first Saturday of December, the snow came early, and the household gathered by instinct in the main room. The fires built high and the lamps lit against the early dark. Someone started music. Faye had a gift for finding the moment that needed it, and Jesse pulled her up and they danced badly and with total commitment in the center of the room, and then Reed offered Leanne his hand with the quiet formality that was his version of exuberance. And Fletcher and Shu Yin danced with the efficiency of people who were too practical to perform sentiment, but had clearly been practicing in private. And Caleb found Meilon at the edge of the firelight and held out his hand, and she took it, and they moved together in the uneven way of people who hadn't been dancing together long enough to be good at it, but had been together long enough not to mind. Outside, Montana did what Montana did in December, vast and cold and indifferent to human arrangements. Inside the ranch house that Gideon Holt had built for generations held 8 people who had arrived from impossibly different places and had become through work and choice and the accumulated weight of shared days, something that no longer needed a word like arrangement to describe it. They were a family. They were home. Faye stopped dancing long enough to look around the room with the expression she wore when something filled her past capacity for casual acknowledgement, the expression that meant she was memorizing it. "What are you doing?" Jesse asked. "Keeping this," she said, "so I can find it later." He understood. They all understood in their different ways that this was the thing you did with happiness. When you'd spent long enough without it, you kept it carefully. You named it, you refused to let it pass unremarked. You stood in the warm room with the people you'd chosen in the snow outside and the fires burning, and you said to yourself and to each other, "This is the thing. This is what we came so far and worked so hard to build. This is what was worth all of it." Meilon leaned her head briefly against Caleb's shoulder, the way she'd been doing since the evening of the court papers, the small, particular gesture that had become between them a language of its own. He held her closer. The snow fell on Iron Bend. The fires burned. The music continued imperfect, inhuman, and entirely sufficient. And 4 brothers and 4 sisters, bound together by the choices that had overwritten every other claim on their futures, danced in the lamplight of the home they had made from whatever the world had given them, and refused to give back. Outside the windows, the great Montana dark went on for miles in every direction, ancient and vast and not unkind. Inside, there was nothing else needed. They had arrived.